The middle decades of the 13th century marked a profound turning point in the political landscape of Europe. For nearly 300 years, the German Empire had stood at the centre of Latin Christendom, projecting authority from the North Sea to the Alps and claiming a universal dignity that rivaled the papacy itself. Yet within a surprisingly short span, that dominance faded. By the time Conrad IV died in 1254, the imperial throne no longer commanded the obedience it once had, and real power inside the German realm had shifted toward a mosaic of territorial princes who governed their own lands with increasing independence. When Rudolf of Habsburg was chosen as king in 1273, the electors deliberately selected a man of modest means from the fringes of the empire rather than one of the great magnates. His authority was limited, his resources thin, and his position dependent on the goodwill of those who had raised him to the throne. From that moment onward, German rulers tended to wear the crown more as a symbol than as an instrument of effective rule, and this pattern endured for centuries. The transformation did not occur overnight. The strengthening of princely lordship and the gradual consolidation of regional territories unfolded over more than 100 years, through countless local struggles and negotiations. Nevertheless, the overall effect was revolutionary. The mighty emperors of the Staufen age had led armies across Italy and dictated terms to popes. Their late medieval successors struggled to influence events even within their own borders. Germany became a land of many centres, rather than one, a condition that would shape its history well into modern times. Understanding how such a dramatic shift took place requires looking beyond the dramatic events of the 1250s and tracing weaknesses that had long existed beneath the glittering surface of imperial power. Even at the height of their prestige, the German kings never governed their vast realm as directly as the rulers of more compact kingdoms. The distances were immense, roads poor and communication slow. A monarch travelling from the Rhine to Saxony or from Bavaria to the North Sea required weeks, sometimes months, and during his absence, local lords managed affairs as they pleased. In England or Sicily, by contrast, smaller territories and more developed administrations allowed kings to impose decisions with greater consistency. The German Empire remained in many ways a personal dominion held together by loyalty to a dynasty, rather than by permanent institutions. Imperial authority rested on three main pillars. The first was the extraordinary wealth accumulated by the Staufen family. By combining their private inheritance with lands attached to the crown, rulers such as Frederick Barbarossa controlled hundreds of castles and vast estates scattered across the realm. No other prince approached this level of resources. Even the powerful Duke Henry the Lion possessed only a fraction of the fortresses held by the emperor, and many of those were lost after his conflict with Barbarossa. The geographical spread of imperial property gave the monarch influence in many regions and allowed him to reward followers with offices and revenues. A second support was the close relationship between the crown and the church. Although earlier conflicts between popes and emperors had formally limited royal intervention in ecclesiastical appointments, in practice, German rulers continued to exert considerable influence. Bishops frequently came from the imperial chapel, and many owed their positions to royal favour. During renewed quarrels with Rome in the 1160s, most German prelates stood firmly behind the emperor, rather than the pope. Royal journeys through the empire often involved long stays in episcopal cities where bishops hosted the court in their own residences, a visible sign of cooperation. Disputes certainly occurred, yet the general pattern remained one of partnership that strengthened royal authority. The third pillar was the prestige of the imperial title itself. To be crowned emperor in Rome symbolized leadership of Christendom and carried immense moral weight. German princes valued their role in electing the king and regarded papal confirmation as secondary. This sense of shared honour enabled rulers like Barbarossa to summon magnates for campaigns in Italy and to mediate quarrels among rival nobles. When the emperor supported a particular duke, resistance usually melted away. When he turned against a former favourite, even powerful figures could be brought low. The crown served as an arbiter whose voice mattered. Yet these strengths concealed serious limitations. Large regions lay beyond effective royal reach. In the southeast around Salzburg, in much of Lotharingia, and across the wide plains of northern Germany, the monarch possessed few estates and seldom visited. Local dukes controlled bishops and towns, and even the fall of Henry the Lion did little to extend direct imperial power there, for his confiscated lands were granted to other lords, rather than retained by the crown. Administration also remained personal, rather than national. Royal officials managed imperial estates, but had no jurisdiction over territories held by other princes. Unlike England or Sicily, Germany lacked a uniform system of sheriffs, justiciars, or financial officers responsible to the king across the whole realm. These structural weaknesses became painfully evident after the disputed succession of 1198. Civil war between rival claimants drained resources and undermined respect for royal authority. To secure military support, both sides mortgaged or sold estates that had formed the backbone of imperial power. Chroniclers lamented that villages, churches, and castles were pledged to followers until little remained except the empty name of lordship. Even after Frederick II regained control, the process of alienation continued, and later papal hostility accelerated the loss of property. By the mid-13th century, the crown was far poorer than it had been in Barbarossa's day. At the same time, the bond with the church weakened. Competing kings promised wide freedoms to bishops in exchange for papal recognition, renouncing many traditional rights over elections and revenues. Once Frederick II left Germany to rule his southern kingdom, these concessions became permanent realities. Ecclesiastical princes gained greater control over their vassals and lands, and royal officials were forbidden to interfere. Similar privileges were later granted to secular princes. What had begun as tactical promises during a crisis evolved into a new constitutional order that acknowledged the autonomy of territorial rulers. Prestige alone could not compensate for the erosion of material and institutional foundations. The imperial peace proclaimed in 1235 spoke grandly of royal authority. Yet enforcement depended largely on the very princes whose independence was growing. With the emperor absent in Italy and locked in bitter struggle with the papacy, respect for the crown declined further. Regional rulers began to issue their own peace ordinances, once a strictly royal prerogative, and towns formed leagues to maintain order without imperial guidance. The centre could no longer hold. Up to this point, the story has focused mostly on the crown, because the limits of royal power help explain what happened next. Once those limits are clear, it becomes easier to see why the princes were able to step forward in the mid-13th century and occupy the space that a weakened monarchy could no longer control. The rise of these regional rulers was not a sudden invention, and it was not a single coordinated movement. It unfolded slowly, beginning around the time of the great struggles between kings and popes and continuing deep into the 13th century. It also did not follow one neat pattern. Different families advanced at different speeds, in different regions, by different methods. In many cases, this growth was not even fully planned in advance. It was the result of ambition, opportunity, and constant improvisation in a political world where authority was often negotiated, rather than enforced. From around the early 12th century onward, a new kind of local dominance becomes visible across the German lands. Powerful dynasties began to concentrate property, legal rights, revenues, and loyal followers inside particular regions until they effectively became the strongest force there. Many of these families carried impressive titles such as Duke or Margrave, but the title itself usually followed success rather than creating it. It added status, helped win recognition, and made a lord look grand at court, yet the real foundation was always local power on the ground. In fact, there were moments when a title sounded more solid than the reality behind it. One notable dynasty in the southwest, for example, continued to claim ducal rank even after losing the office that originally justified it. Their influence in their home region still grew. Their claims were tolerated, and their status became accepted over time, which shows how flexible political language could be when backed by land, castles, and armed men. The practical building of regional power was usually slow, piecemeal, and sometimes brutal. Stronger lords pressured weaker neighbours into giving up rights, handing over estates, accepting vassal status, or signing agreements that quietly shifted the balance of power. A lord without sons could be pushed toward naming a powerful neighbour as heir, sometimes presented as a friendly settlement, sometimes felt as a forced choice. Castles multiplied across the landscape, not only as defensive structures, but as administrative centres, where authority could be exercised daily. These fortresses were staffed and protected by a class of service knights, who were personally tied to their lord and depended on him for status and livelihood. Through them, a dynasty could extend its reach into valleys, towns, forests, and trade routes, turning scattered possessions into something closer to a coherent lordship. Marriage mattered just as much as steel. Some families climbed from local importance to the highest rank by marrying into inheritances again and again, collecting counties and rights through heiresses and contested successions. A small count might become a major regional power, not by conquering a neighbour, but by marrying into a claim and then defending it successfully. This was one reason why certain dynasties seemed to rise suddenly. The groundwork had been laid quietly at the altar, long before it became visible on the battlefield or at an election assembly. In the same way, princes learned to draw wealth and influence from the church without always submitting to the church's control. They sought land held by bishops and abbots as fiefs, used legal roles as protectors of ecclesiastical institutions to interfere in their affairs, and squeezed revenues from lands that technically belonged to monasteries. Clergy often complained bitterly about these protectors, because protection could look very much like exploitation. The methods range from legal pressure and clever lawsuits to intimidation, seizure, and open violence. When a powerful duke took over a county that should have passed into ecclesiastical hands, the resentment could last for generations and shape regional politics for decades. At the same time, these rising lords did not rely only on plunder or political maneuvers. They also expanded their income by reshaping the countryside. Forests and wastelands were cleared, new villages founded, and new towns planned as hubs of trade and dues. Rents, tolls, minting rights, market fees, and urban levies could transform a lord's finances. Along the eastern frontiers especially, rulers encouraged settlers, merchants, and skilled workers to move into newly established communities, because more people meant more production and more revenue. Yet even this apparently constructive activity rested on coercion. Landlords guarded their woods, their waters, and their rights fiercely. When outsiders tried to clear land without permission, the response could be swift and threatening. In some regions, a lord's warning made it clear that unauthorized settlement would be met with destruction, punishment, and sometimes death. Even later, when procedures became more formal, punishments remained severe. orders to abandon land within days. Heavy fines and demands for compensation were used to protect the lord's control over territory and resources. Nothing strengthened a regional ruler more reliably than judicial authority. The ability to hold courts, decide disputes, enforce penalties, and ultimately impose capital punishment turned a lord into the final arbiter of life and property within a district. This kind of high jurisdiction had deep roots in older structures of local government, originally tied to county authority. Over time, ambitious dynasties collected these rights along with land because justice generated income and also created obedience. A lord who controlled courts could punish enemies, protect allies, intimidate rivals, and bind communities to his rule. That is why comital titles and judicial privileges were fought over so intensely. They were not decorative honours, they were tools that shaped everyday power. Regional princes also understood the value of memory, image, and sacred legitimacy. Many founded monasteries, endowing them with land and privileges. These houses provided prayers, prestige, and influence, but they also served as family burial places and visible monuments to dynastic standing. A monastery could become a stage on which a lineage displayed its dignity, recorded its past, and taught later generations to see the dynasty as ancient and destined to rule. Inside these institutions, stories were written that celebrated founding ancestors, explained a family's rise as rightful and honourable, and placed local power inside a grand narrative. This was not only devotion, it was political branding in medieval form. As new dynasties entered the top ranks, they too created their own memorial centres, ensuring that their status would look permanent rather than accidental. The pace of these developments varied widely. Some families began aggressively early, using periods of civil conflict to demand fiefs from churchmen, expand their military followings, and acquire counties. Their own chroniclers sometimes describe transfers as voluntary gifts, but in a world of unequal power, voluntary could be a matter of perspective. Other dynasties rose later, lifted by royal favour during moments when the crown needed reliable allies. A monarch could elevate a family by granting offices, confirming claims, or backing them against rivals. In return, those families supplied troops, money, and political support. Along frontier regions, rulers often encouraged strong local lords because they provided stability and defence. That reminder matters. The growth of territorial princes was not always a direct rebellion against the crown. At times, it was assisted by the crown because it solved immediate problems. One of the clearest examples of this crown-driven strategy occurred when a new principality was effectively created through negotiation. A major dispute over a great ducal title threatened to destabilize the realm, and the king needed peace among his leading men in order to campaign elsewhere. The compromise that followed gave one claimant the disputed ducal title, while allowing the other to keep ducal rank over his own extensive lands. What made the settlement exceptional was how far it went in guaranteeing independence. The new arrangement ensured heredity within the ruling line, allowed a successor to be chosen in the absence of direct heirs, confirmed existing holdings, removed outside authority from the region, and granted full judicial control within the territory. Military service was restricted to nearby areas. In effect, the crown traded long-term control for short-term stability, gaining peace at home and troops for campaigns abroad. This bargain worked in the immediate sense. The realm was quieted, major princes joined military expeditions, and alliances held for a time. The dynasty that benefited remained loyal and contributed to wider imperial projects, including warfare, diplomacy, and major political deals. Successions and inheritances were also managed with royal support, further strengthening that regional house. But the deeper consequence was unavoidable. A model of near-independent territorial power had been openly endorsed. What other dynasties had achieved slowly by force and calculation, one family received in a single settlement, wrapped in legality and granted from above. Nor was that episode unique. Over and over, kings and emperors made grants that expanded the authority of individual princes or powerful bishops. Sometimes a regional lord received sweeping rights in a borderland. Sometimes a ruler accepted a new royal title for a neighbouring prince. Sometimes a bishopric or archbishopric gained ducal-style authority over a large region. These were rarely gifts made out of generosity. They were payments for military assistance, tools for settling disputes among magnates, or strategies for keeping the political elite satisfied while the ruler focused attention elsewhere. The pattern became even clearer under later rulers, when the crown faced intense external pressure and urgently needed reliable supporters. In those circumstances, strengthening a prince could be treated as a price worth paying to hold a coalition together. By the 1240s, the logic reached an extreme. Faced with fierce challenges and the risk of losing legitimacy, the crown was willing to consider dramatic promotions and new titles for former enemies if that would stabilise the situation. This reveals the long arc behind the mid-13th century power shift. The princes did not simply seize authority when the monarchy weakened. They had been building their bases for generations. They had learned to gather land, rights, revenues, courts, castles, and followers into compact regions that functioned almost like small states. They had also benefited from rulers who repeatedly exchanged pieces of central authority for immediate political advantage. When the crown finally lost its financial strength, its church influence, and much of its practical reach, the princes were already in position. The vacuum did not stay empty because local powers had been preparing, step by step, to fill it. Inside their own heartlands, the Stalin dynasty behaved much like the other rising territorial lords of the age. They built influence the same way, pressed the same advantages, and relied on the same tools. The real difference was not the method but the scale. Their dominance did not rest on a single compact region. It spread across several zones at once. Their strongest roots lay in Swabia, though even there they had to compete with other ambitious dynasties. They also held substantial positions in Alsace, maintained interests along the eastern frontier, and gained additional weight in the western borderlands after a major marriage alliance in the mid-12th century. Even in regions where their direct property was thinner, their influence still reached far through legal roles and patronage. They retained what remained of the royal fiscal resources, and that alone distinguished them from most rivals. Yet in practice, their day-to-day strategy looked familiar: expanding estates, tightening control, and turning scattered rights into real authority. The Stalin drive to accumulate land and followers was constant. Earlier generations of the family were already known for strengthening their position by fortifying the landscape with castles and drawing warriors into their service through generosity and rewards. Such a following could not exist without major income and wide-landed resources, which pushed the dynasty toward acquisition whenever opportunities appeared. Under the long reign of the most famous Stalin ruler, expansion became almost a habit. Part of the motive was straightforward. A large dynasty needed lands to support sons and allies, and security depended on creating a family network strong enough to hold the throne after the ruler's death. Disasters could also create openings. When epidemic and warfare produced sudden deaths among the great lords, inheritances became unsettled, and claims could be shaped by pressure, purchase, and political leverage. The Stalin moved quickly to secure the succession to territories left vulnerable by the extinction of lines or the weakening of heirs. Sometimes this meant sharing advantages with allies, to keep coalitions stable. Sometimes it meant paying heavily for a future inheritance that would pay back many times over. One especially important acquisition in southern Germany confirmed Staufen strength in Swabia, yet it also sharpened tensions with a powerful rival branch of the wider aristocracy and helped push an already fragile relationship toward open rupture. During the same years, another quieter change was taking place. The political imagination of the empire began to shift. A clearer idea emerged that a small circle at the top of the nobility formed a distinct class whose dependence ran directly to the emperor alone. In other words, an informal sense developed that there were princes of the realm who stood above ordinary counts and lords. These were not simply people with grand titles. They were the figures who had succeeded in turning local dominance into something close to regional sovereignty, commanding castles, courts, revenues, and armed followings in a defined area. The notion did not appear all at once, and it is difficult to say exactly when it solidified, because later generations often described earlier events in language that reflected their own world. A famous ceremony in the 1180s, for example, was later remembered as if it formally elevated a count into princely rank by granting him a new frontier lordship. Yet the accounts written closest to the event speak mainly about the transfer of lands, not about an explicit reclassification of status. That gap raises a simple possibility. Later, copyists and administrators may have expressed older realities using newer terminology. Even so, it would be misleading to treat the emergence of the princes as nothing more than a scribal invention. Structural shifts inside the empire were pushing society in that direction. The downfall of a great duke at the start of the 1180s was one such turning point. After that, older patterns of ducal authority broke apart and were redistributed. Instead of a few powerful dukes acting as semi-public governors over large provinces, authority became more fragmented, more localized, and more private. New holders received ducal titles, but the title itself was less a command over a vast province than a badge of rank attached to a family's own dominion. The old provincial style of rule receded. In its place, late medieval lordship grew. Dynasties governing their own lands as if those lands were miniature states built from property, jurisdiction, revenues, and loyalty networks they had assembled themselves. The new dukes who benefited from these changes still had to do the hard work of consolidation. Holding a ducal title did not automatically produce obedience. Some new ruling houses began with a fragile claim and strengthened it by relentless acquisition, using every extinction of a minor aristocratic line as a chance to absorb castles, villages, and rights. Purchases, settlements, and pressure all played a part. Major inheritances could be politically dramatic, especially when the absorbed family had been a long-standing rival. Gains of that kind did more than expand a map. They removed enemies and created new administrative reach. Over time, such expansions turned a vulnerable ducal house into a dominant regional power. Privatization and localization of authority also encouraged another habit that would shape Germany for centuries: dividing territories within a ruling family. In the 13th century, several princely dynasties split lands and titles between branches. A duchy might be divided between brothers only a generation after it had been created, and then divided again soon after. Over the long run, repeated partitions produced a landscape of many small lordships, each with its own court, its own officials, and its own rivalries. This was not a rare accident, but a recurring pattern, and it pushed the political geography toward fragmentation even as certain families were still expanding. From the outside, the late 12th century can therefore look like a paradox. Imperial authority still appeared impressive. Great assemblies were held. The emperor still travelled with a large court. The rhetoric of royal justice and universal rule remained strong. Yet beneath that surface, a decisive step had been taken. Territorial princes were becoming the true managers of power in their regions. This did not necessarily mean constant hostility between ruler and princes. Under strong emperors, the relationship often resembled partnership, with leading lords supporting royal projects in return for recognition and advantage. But the balance depended heavily on the strength and presence of the monarch. That balance shifted sharply in the early 13th century. The monarchy's foundations weakened, and the ruler increasingly governed from afar, absorbed by other regions and long struggles beyond Germany. Attempts to rule through sons did not solve the problem. When heirs were minors, they were ineffective. When they grew older, conflicts within the dynasty erupted. Rival claimants appeared, competing kings were proclaimed, and the crown's ability to impose order declined further. In some regions of Germany, contemporary narratives barely mention the king at all. Local conflicts, feuds, and rivalries filled the scene, and royal authority seemed distant, intermittent, and often irrelevant. Even when the crown issued legal declarations against rebels, local leaders were typically left to handle the crisis without meaningful royal money, soldiers, or intervention. Mediation efforts could be ignored. Royal commands could be openly defied. The point was not simply that kings failed now and then, but that the machinery required to make royal decisions decisive was missing. By the middle of the 13th century, the reality of princely power was obvious, but the process did not end there. Territorial rulers increasingly adopted quasi-royal styles in their documents and public image, presenting themselves as rulers by divine favour and displaying authority through building programs, churches, art, and ritual. They developed more systematic local administrations and new forms of record-keeping to track revenues and obligations. Boundaries began to harden into something closer to fixed borders. In later centuries, some princes introduced broader taxation across their lands, treating their territories less as collections of estates and more as unified fiscal spaces. Yet even as regional government became more structured, Germany did not become stable. The political map remained volatile, pulled in two opposite directions at once: consolidation on one side and fragmentation on the other. One force driving fragmentation was the repeated division of lands among heirs. This did not affect only the greatest dynasties. Even ambitious families still rising through acquisitions sometimes split their territories early, multiplying branches and competing lines. The other destabilizing force was extinction. When a major dynasty died out in the male line, the resulting vacuum rarely produced a smooth transition. Co-heiresses, rival husbands, distant cousins, neighbouring princes and church lords could all claim pieces of the inheritance. Because princely holdings were often scattered across wide areas and held under different legal arrangements, disputes became tangled. Some properties were free family lands, others were held as fiefs from different overlords, and still others were tied to ecclesiastical institutions with their own claims. Settlement required years of negotiation, pressure, and warfare, and even after formal agreements, dissatisfied parties frequently continued to press claims. The consequences could be region-wide instability, lasting for a decade or more. In some cases, disputes simmered and flared repeatedly, dragging local communities into cycles of raids, sieges, and shifting alliances. In others, the struggle escalated into major wars that turned an entire principality into a battleground. Eventually, new powers rose to take advantage of the openings created by extinction. But even their victories did not instantly restore order. A new ruling house might need generations to consolidate what it had gained, and to turn disputed claims into effective governance. In this world, lordship was never just a legal title sitting neatly inside a hierarchy. It functioned as an everyday social practice, something performed and contested in public, enforced through relationships, and proven again and again through action. Kings and princes competed over rights, spheres of influence, courts, tolls, markets, and the loyalty of people who lived and worked inside those spheres. Claims were asserted, challenged, defended, and sometimes quietly abandoned when circumstances turned against them. Success depended on forces inside a family and pressures outside it. Some houses managed to turn themselves from a loose kin group into a durable dynasty with a recognizable identity. Others failed because they could not secure enough land, income, armed support, or strategic marriages. Rival competition mattered, but so did the interventions of kings, who could confirm holdings, redistribute rights, and decide which claims would be treated as legitimate. Modern historians have approached the growth of princely power from many angles, not only through law and formal institutions, but also through social structures, economic change, and the ways authority was communicated through documents, rituals, and public reputation. In the Roman-German world of the Middle Ages, princely power involved control over land and control over people at the same time. Lordship was anchored in place, yet it did not always look like a neatly bounded territory on a map. Borders were often unclear, overlapping, or contested. Still, both church lords and lay lords worked to make their will effective within whatever space they could claim, using administrative offices, legal representation, and networks of servicemen placed in castles and towns. In many regions, this push to intensify control becomes especially visible around the year 1200, and throughout the 13th century, a series of practical innovations took root. By the beginning of the modern period, these developments helped make it possible to speak about territorial states, even though that later outcome should not be projected backward too confidently. A long debate has revolved around intention. The changing interpretation of feud is part of this shift. Feuding is no longer treated mainly as an early stage of state building, a rough method used to join scattered rights into a territorial structure. Instead, feuding is increasingly understood as a way to defend honor, status, and position inside a competitive aristocratic society. Even here, the key issue was often the ordering of personal relations and rank, not the creation of a coherent territorial administration. Lords made use of many different rights, and those rights did not always fit together neatly. A principality could grow through a toll here, a market privilege there, a court right somewhere else, and a castle jurisdiction on another frontier. Expansion was shaped by chance as much as by design. Marriages could suddenly bring in land. A birth could secure a succession. A death could fracture a region. Political actors reacted to these shocks, exploited openings, and attempted to lock in whatever gains they could. When major dynasties died out, relatives and neighbours often profited, and some families gained decisive advantages by inheriting portions of another house's network of rights and lands. Yet the spread of princely lordship was not achieved only through agreements, inheritances, and legal settlements. Military force played an obvious role. Rivalries over rights and property could turn into armed conflict, and success in war could translate into real expansion of authority. Battles mattered not because they created a new legal world overnight, but because they changed who could enforce claims, who could intimidate rivals, and who could present themselves as the inevitable local power. To make sense of the overall pattern, it helps to track both internal and external influences, the role of kings in shaping the playing field, the differences between church principalities and secular ones, the resources available to rulers, and the everyday techniques used to implement authority. Royal power did not simply fade in a straight line, it shifted across phases. Under strong dynasties, kingship shaped the conditions under which princes rose. Kings granted fiefs and rights, confirmed possessions, and sometimes tried to assert their own authority against princely rivals in specific regions. Then came a prolonged moment of weakness, in which effective royal rule was largely absent, allowing princes and towns to secure positions that would have been harder to claim under a more active crown. After that, kings returned, but they returned in a changed environment where election politics, dynastic resources, and noble coalitions limited what a king could do. During the era of strong royal houses, princes were typically treated as subordinate in the hierarchy, but they also expected the king to protect their interests and to provide rights and lordship spaces appropriate to their rank. In the early 13th century, long royal absences from Germany had a massive impact. When the king was far away, the practical enforcement of royal claims weakened, and princes filled gaps with their own courts, their own peacekeeping measures, and their own networks of dependents. Legal confirmations issued by the crown during this period helped to anchor princely power by recognizing rights that princes were already exercising in practice, but that remained contested in theory. A period of royal weakness followed the death of a powerful ruler in the mid-13th century. Several claimants held the royal title during these years, yet none possessed the strength, resources, or position needed to enforce rule across the realm. In this environment, secular and ecclesiastical princes, along with the towns, consolidated their legal standing and extended it in important ways. The political structure of royal election also became more defined, with a small group of leading magnates increasingly recognized as the decisive electors. This development mattered because it turned royal authority into something dependent on elite agreement. Princes and bishops expanded their claims to rights and territories, absorbing weaker nobles and servicemen into their own systems. Towns, facing insecurity and disorder, formed leagues to protect trade, enforce peace, and defend privileges. Such leagues could be aimed at reducing violence in the absence of royal enforcement, but they also served as barriers against princely ambitions. The years of weak kingship thus accelerated two parallel trends: the rise of the princes as providers of order, and the growing confidence and autonomy of urban communities and wealthy townspeople. When a new king was elected in the 1270s, one visible goal was to recover lost royal possessions, often with princely support. Yet the deeper reality had shifted. Kings were increasingly dependent on the very princes who elected them. Rulers did not manage to build a stable royal territory that could support independent kingship without relying on personal family resources. After 1300, the strength of the crown often depended on the ruler's position as a territorial lord in his own right. A king who lacked a strong dynastic base found it difficult to act as an effective monarch. The relationship between king and princes became less like a strict chain of command and more like a shared political club in which cooperation, bargaining, and coalition building mattered as much as formal superiority. Within this environment, certain princely houses and church institutions managed to secure lasting regions of authority and pass them down within dynasties, or preserve them within an archbishopric or bishopric. Over time, successful centralization turned scattered rights into a more complex and integrated power structure. Several long-lasting dynasties came to dominate major regions, while other families rose and fell depending on luck, marriages, and political outcomes. The word prince itself also changed meaning. In earlier centuries, it was a broad label for leading men, both clerical and lay, more a marker of social standing than a strict legal category. From around the late 12th century onward, the term narrowed. A prince increasingly meant a lord who held key rights and lordship directly from the king, including judicial authority and economic privileges like tolls and minting. In legal thought, this implied direct subordination to the king. In practice, the situation remained more layered, because even high princes could hold rights through other lords, especially through church connections and forms of legal representation. Status was not erased by those indirect ties, but the need to distinguish princes from other high nobles became sharper, since many counts and lords also held fiefs from the king. One practical distinction was the scale of power. A prince typically controlled a lordship that resembled a duchy in breadth and authority, including high justice, meaning the capacity to impose severe penalties. Formal elevation to princely rank could involve a ritual of rearranging property rights, with lands and rights symbolically concentrated and then re-granted as a single package. Over the 13th century, additional principalities were recognized, and the number of secular princes increased over time, partly because partitions within dynasties multiplied the number of princely branches. Even so, ecclesiastical princes remained numerous, since bishops, archbishops, and leading abbots held substantial authority in their own right. Geography shaped the pace and character of development. Some regions lay close to the king's frequent routes and centres of activity, where royal influence remained more visible and political tools could be used in familiar ways. Other landscapes were more open to royal intervention because they contained key electoral territories, or strategic corridors. Beyond these were regions dominated by powerful dynasties that also competed for the throne. And then, the most distant zones, especially in the north and east, where the crown had less presence and local consolidation often required settlement, missionary activity, colonization, and military force. Yet across both old heartlands and newer frontier regions, rulers often viewed lordship primarily as authority over people, rather than as control over a sharply bounded space. Only in a few exceptional cases does a more territorial definition appear early, where vassals began to identify themselves with a county or a region, rather than with the person of the lord. For the period as a whole, such examples remained unusual. The church principalities followed a distinctive path. A settlement, in the early 12th century, changed the balance between kings and bishops by limiting how far royal authority could reach into spiritual office, even though kings still held considerable influence over the worldly rights attached to bishoprics. This created a lasting dual nature in episcopal power. A bishop was both spiritual leader and secular ruler. Over time, the zone of spiritual responsibility and the zone of secular lordship did not always match neatly. Within the secular sphere, bishops relied on rights of fortification, minting, markets, courts, and revenues, and they built administrations to enforce them. Cathedral chapters often elected bishops and could act as political forces in their own right, defending their privileges and sometimes resisting the bishop's control over incomes and rights. These chapters also became channels through which lesser nobles gained access to power and income, providing careers for younger sons. Over time, they guarded their exclusivity, demanding proof of noble lineage from candidates. Church lordships had one structural advantage over secular dynasties. They were not inherited in the same way and were therefore less vulnerable to partitions among heirs. Yet they faced their own conflicts, including disputed elections, rival factions within chapters, and pressure from external authorities. Royal concessions to ecclesiastical rulers also mattered. In the early 13th century, the Crown confirmed broad rights for church princes in their secular domains and limited royal interference in their economic and administrative structures. Kings promised not to establish new tolls or mints in those regions. not to build new castles or towns there, and not to draw away the servicemen tied to ecclesiastical lords. Royal courts pledged to respect the decisions of church courts and to help enforce them. Such measures strengthened bishops and archbishops as territorial rulers, not only by increasing their rights, but by recognizing their practical control. The building of ecclesiastical lordship still required struggle on the ground. Bishops often had to confront advocates and secular protectors who tried to treat church lands as opportunities for profit and influence. In some regions, bishops fought for generations to free their lordship from these external claims, and real consolidation sometimes became possible only after a rival comital family died out. Across the realm, leading archbishoprics and many bishoprics gradually assembled territorial authority through a mixture of royal grants, local administration, legal pressure, and political alliances. Alongside them stood the lordships of imperial monasteries and convents, whose abbots and abbesses also exercised significant rights. In the Roman-German world, cities rarely behaved like the great communes of northern Italy. Italian city-states often dominated wide rural belts beyond their walls. But most towns in the empire did not rule the countryside in a comparable way. After the mid-13th century, only a small number managed to gain real authority outside the gates, usually as part of their struggle to free themselves from the lords who claimed control over the town itself. Where it happened, it tended to be in regions where princely power had not hardened into strong territorial structures, places where the political landscape still left room for urban expansion. Certain towns in Swabia, Franconia, and the emerging Swiss world benefited from that situation. Their councils, and sometimes wealthy citizens or institutions connected to the town, acquired pieces of jurisdiction in nearby villages, took over protective legal roles over religious houses, and occasionally gained control over tolls and transport dues. The method was often simple: money. Local nobles regularly needed cash, and townspeople who had prospered through trade could buy rights outright or accept them as pledges in return for loans. Only a minority of towns accumulate a substantial rural sphere, and even then the result was usually a patchwork of different rights, rather than a cleaned territorial block. In a few places that patchwork could be expanded much later into something closer to territorial rule, especially where a city steadily combined court rights, transport privileges, and control of routes into a coherent system. Other cities did not build a political hinterland at all, yet still shaped the region economically by controlling markets, credit, and trade flows. Whether the approach was political or economic, the goal remained practical. Protect the town from neighbouring lords, keep roads safe, ensure food supplies, and preserve urban dominance by limiting rural competition in crafts and trade. Revenue also mattered, since dues, tolls, and taxes helped pay for walls, guards, and diplomacy. While towns expanded only selectively, princely and ecclesiastical lordship developed into the most typical form of administrative rule in medieval Germany. By the later 13th and early 14th centuries, the Principalities had become the main arena where authority was gathered, organised, and enforced. This growth did not rely on one single right or one single institution. It rested on stacking many different powers together, slowly turning a collection of privileges into something that could function as a regional government. The foundations were usually land held outright by a family, and lands held through grants from the king. Yet land alone did not create a principality. The decisive step was acquiring the special rights that allowed rulers to command, tax, judge, and protect. These included high justice, markets, minting, tolls, transport dues, the building of castles and the fortifying of towns, legal protection of churches and monasteries, and the authority to impose peace. Such rights were often presented as gifts from the crown in exchange for service, but they could also be fought over, purchased, inherited, or seized. Church lords and lay lords competed for these powers. In that competition, lesser nobles tended to lose. If their families did not die out, many were absorbed into the structures of larger princes, becoming dependents rather than autonomous players. Marriage was another engine of expansion, and it worked in several ways at once. A marriage could seal a friendship between dynasties, end a conflict, or create obligations of mutual support against a third rival. It also functioned as a long bet on the future. Contracts could shape inheritance plans in advance, and marriage to an heiress could merge two clusters of rights and lands into one. Territory could also be expanded more directly through purchases of land, or of rights tied to land. In a world where everything from a village court to a toll station could be treated as a commodity, money and legal instruments often achieved what armies could not. Force still mattered, and it mattered constantly. Princes used raids, campaigns, and private war to pressure rivals, to settle claims, and to intimidate opponents. Fighting could be directed not only at other princes, but also at counts and service elites, who held royal offices or castles. Even conflict within a dynasty could turn violent when branches competed over inheritance. Yet private war was not simply chaos. It operated inside a framework of accepted rules. A feud that followed those rules could be treated as legitimate, not criminal. One important peace ordinance issued in the early 13th century reflected this reality, by requiring that a party first seek justice in a court before launching a feud. Under that kind of system, military strength became essential not only for gaining new rights, but for maintaining prestige, because honour and rank were closely tied to the ability to defend oneself and punish insults. The practical tools of rule were visible in stone and timber long before they became visible in paperwork. Up to the middle of the 14th century, castles and then, increasingly towns, formed the backbone of princely control. Castles were defended and administered by service knights bound to the prince, and they functioned as places where a ruler could travel, hold court, stage ceremonies, and project magnificence. A grand castle household was not just an ornament. It was a recruiting tool, drawing servicemen by promising reward, status, and proximity to power. Certain princes became famous for hosting an entire courtly culture around them, using festivals, patronage, and display to maintain loyalty and impress rivals. To extend authority beyond the immediate reach of a single fortress, princes created local offices and delegated power. Officials appointed by the prince were tasked with keeping order, collecting dues and enforcing decisions. These structures were uneven at first, but they laid the groundwork for more systematic administration. After the mid-13th century, towns grew more important than castles in many regions. Towns served as administrative hubs, temporary residences, and financial engines. Princes still moved around their lands, but towns offered safer bases, stronger walls, cash markets, and concentrated resources. Urban taxes, tolls, and militias could be mobilized more effectively than scattered rural dues. This was not limited to one dynasty. Across the empire, ruling houses learned to use towns as revenue sources and as anchors for control over the surrounding countryside. Dynastic identity also became an instrument of rule. Tombs and memorial sites in monastic and collegiate churches were more than religious gestures. They reinforced a sense of continuity, linking the living family to its dead and presenting the dynasty as a lasting institution rather than a temporary household. Burial churches, commemorative rituals, and written family histories encouraged solidarity across generations. The past was shaped into a story of rightful rank and remembered deeds, supported by prayers for souls and the prestige of sacred patronage. That shared identity made it easier to hold lands together, defend rights, and demand loyalty. A prince who could present his family as ancient and destined to rule often found it easier to impose authority than one whose power looked newly assembled. For a surprisingly long time, the evidence for detailed financial administration remains thin. Many princes ruled effectively without leaving behind clear records of income and expenditures. Still, early signs appear. Some dynasties compiled registers of possessions relatively early, attempting to map their resources and obligations. In certain regions, relationships of dependence began to be written down with greater precision. Throughout the 13th century, the volume of documents increased, and by the late 13th century, some rulers ordered key documents copied into organized collections. That required trained writing staff, and such specialists appeared earlier in parts of the Western Empire than in many German principalities. Even so, it was mainly in the 14th century that central administrations became clearly visible. Permanent chancellors, archives, systematic registers of revenues, and books recording fiefs, received and granted. The shift from rule by memory and travel to rule supported by paperwork was slow, but it changed what a principality could do. Even with these tools, princes faced serious obstacles. The most decisive threat was simple biology. Dynasties could vanish when there were no male heirs, and no amount of strategy could prevent that. Ironically, too many children could also be dangerous. In a world where lordship was treated as family property, sons expected shares, and partitions were common. Division often weakened a dynasty's political and economic position by breaking a principality into smaller, poorer pieces. Families that succeeded over the long term were those that found ways to balance inheritance with cohesion. They created family agreements to regulate partitions while preserving unity where possible, defined rules for cooperation between branches, and tried to prevent the loss of rights and lands. One practical method was channeling some sons into church careers, reducing the number of heirs who would demand territorial shares. Strict primogeniture did not become the normal solution in this period. Instead, rulers often preferred flexibility, selecting among sons and keeping the option of passing lordship to collateral branches if a main line died out. Money created another set of problems. Even powerful princes regularly faced financial strain. Rights and possessions were constantly evaluated, converted into cash, and traded, especially when relatives needed compensation during partitions, or when daughters' dowries had to be paid. Maintaining a court was expensive. Travel, gifts, military costs, and appearances at royal assemblies drained resources. Income was often unpredictable, and budgets could not be planned with confidence. As a result, pledging became a routine practice. Princes mortgaged tolls, taxes, villages, and rights to obtain ready cash. Urban merchants played a major role as creditors, and Jewish communities in certain towns were also important lenders. In some cases, a ruler's travel route was shaped as much by the need for revenue as by politics, moving toward places where toll stations or payments could be collected. This constant monetization of rights had a political consequence. It made closed, neatly bounded, territorial states difficult to build. When pieces of authority were repeatedly pawned, sold, redeemed, and pawned again, lordship remained a shifting mosaic, rather than a solid block. A striking slogan once summed up an older way of thinking about the German past. The Middle Ages were treated as Germany's destiny. For much of the 19th and 20th centuries, many historians argued that Germany's historical path differed sharply from that of other European realms, and that the explanation lay in medieval, political development. While England and France appeared to move towards stronger centralised monarchy, the German realm was described as moving in the opposite direction. Central royal power, so the argument ran, did not consolidate in the same way, and the modern nation-state arrived far later as a result. This view fed a larger story about a distinct German trajectory, a narrative that became deeply influential and lingered for generations, even when scholars began to question its assumptions. Earlier, historians were rarely shy about judging winners and losers. A dramatic plot took shape, a story of imperial failure in which kings were gradually worn down by hostile popes and unruly princes. This argument became famous through heated debates over whether the ruler's focus on Italy and the imperial crown had drained strength away from Germany and helped undermine royal authority at home. Within that older outlook, the moral casting was often clear. Many historians writing in a Prussian and Protestant intellectual climate tended to sympathise with the kings. Princes, by contrast, were frequently depicted as destructive forces, accused of seizing rights that supposedly belonged to the crown and weakening the political unity of the realm. The rise of territorial lordship in the High and Late Middle Ages was treated as a kind of theft from the monarchy, and the final outcome was presented as a long slide toward fragmentation. After the First World War, the tone and the questions changed. A new field focused on regions and local power gained momentum. It was not an accident that this happened in a period when German borders and identity were under strain. Scholars turned to regional pasts, partly to clarify what earlier Germany had looked like and which lands could be imagined as historically connected. In that setting, the growth of lordship over specific areas became a central theme. Territorial states of the early modern era were reinterpreted as the continuation of medieval, princely and noble power, rather than as a regrettable breakdown of monarchy. Some influential models even suggested that older forms of aristocratic lordship were deeply rooted and long-lived, and that royal power had only temporarily overlaid them. In this framework, strong monarchy appeared less like the natural goal of political development and more like one force among others, sometimes successful, sometimes not, and never fully dominant for long. This approach encouraged a particular way of describing princely power. Instead of imagining one standard form of a principality, it emphasized that each prince rested on a different mixture of rights. Landholdings, courts, tolls, markets, protection of churches, jurisdiction, and a variety of local privileges. Since the building blocks differed from one region to another, princely lordship couldn't be reduced to a single blueprint. The story became harder to tell as a clean sequence with a clear endpoint. In some versions, the conclusion was almost skeptical. Perhaps the best that could be done was to describe separate cases rather than claim a unified explanation. Behind these shifts lay a broader pattern that often appears in the history of scholarship. Interpretations frequently reflect the concerns of the age in which they are written. In a country shaped by repeated political disruption, it is unsurprising that debates about medieval power also moved in waves. For a long time, historians assumed they could reconstruct the intentions and plans of medieval rulers with confidence. It seemed self-evident that a king must have wanted to strengthen central authority. The modern nation-state, strongly desired in the 19th century, stood in the background as an unspoken yardstick. From that viewpoint, kings and princes were treated as natural enemies, and medieval politics was framed as a long struggle between monarchy and aristocracy. In almost every version of this older storyline, the Staufen age in the 12th century held a special place. Frederick Barbarossa was frequently treated as a pivotal figure. Some writers criticised his imperial ambitions, especially his campaigns and claims in Italy. arguing that they distracted him from strengthening authority in Germany. Yet at the same time, he attracted admiration, even fascination, because contemporaries had already portrayed him as a grand ruler, and later generations inherited that image. Popular historical writing in the 19th century often presented his reign as a high point, and the defeat of a powerful duke in his time was turned into proof that the emperor's position must have been extraordinary. The fall of that duke became a symbol. It was used to argue that the crown, at least under a strong ruler, could still bring the greatest aristocrats to heel. During the 20th century, a different emphasis grew stronger. Instead of focusing only on royal success or failure, scholars began to spotlight the transformation of lordship itself. The 12th century was described as an era when aristocrats increasingly tied power to space. Castles multiplied, monasteries were founded, protective legal roles over churches were exploited, and lords came to think in more territorial terms. This process was used to explain rising tension between king and princes. In some interpretations, Barbarossa appeared as a ruler who tried to contain this trend and reassert royal initiative. The boldest version of that approach argued that the Staufen rulers pursued a deliberate redesign of the political order. In this view, Barbarossa aimed to reduce the independent rights of the great lay nobility by strengthening royal holdings and by relying more heavily on service elites who could be directed more easily. These servicemen, often bound their lord in ways that were different from older aristocratic independence, were imagined as a tool to break the power of high nobles. A second part of the argument held that the king sought to tighten bonds with the top aristocracy through stronger personal obligations, shaping a smaller circle of leading princes whose membership depended on royal recognition. Older, sprawling duchies were weakened or broken into smaller units, and the political map was reshaped. Some historians express this in dramatic language, describing a program that would crush dynastic magnates and elevate a new class of royal dependents. Within that framework, medieval Germany became a stage for an ambitious attempt at central control, ultimately thwarted by the resilience of aristocratic power. The same spirit of the times influenced debates over an apparently technical question. What did the word prince really mean, and when did it become a label for a clearly defined group? For centuries it had been used broadly, sometimes for the ruler himself and often as a vague honorific for leading men. Then, toward the end of the 12th century, the term began to look more exclusive in certain contexts. Later reports described a prominent count being raised to a new rank when granted a frontier lordship. The question followed naturally: was this evidence of a new constitutional order, intentionally created and legally defined? Older scholarship sought clear turning points and precise legal acts. Some historians distinguished an earlier elite based on office holding from a later elite based on personal obligations, treating the shift as a fundamental transformation of political society. Others argued that office did not create nobility, but that nobles held offices because they were already nobles, and that the later princely rank should be seen as a new development rather than a continuation. Prosopographical research, mapping networks of families and careers over time, strengthened the sense that a recognizable aristocratic layer existed long before the 12th century, providing the pool from which officials were drawn. The image of a sharp break between old and new princely classes became harder to sustain. As the discussion matured, attention shifted from words to practices. Some evidence suggests that a more exclusive use of the princely label can be observed during major political crises, especially when a great duke was tried, condemned, and stripped of his position, and witness lists and ceremonial language hinted at a narrower circle of leading men. Yet modern scholarship has generally moved away from the idea of a single decisive founding moment for a legally coherent class. It has become more cautious about treating later legal texts as straightforward mirrors of earlier realities. Still, the problem remained. If the king had many vassals and many nobles owed him obligations, what separated the top princes from the rest? Earlier historians tried to answer this by seeking strict criteria: direct dependence on the king, possession of special royal rights, wide judicial authority, and a territory large enough to resemble a duchy. Ecclesiastical lords, especially bishops and heads of major religious houses, seemed easier to categorize because their position depended on investiture and recognized rights attached to their office. Lay princes were more difficult to define, and this uncertainty encouraged scholars to search for a single legal formula that could settle the matter. Some even imagined a formal imperial law created under Barbarossa, a deliberate reform that restructured the political system. A different line of argument reversed the logic. Instead of seeing the crown as the architect and the princes as reluctant beneficiaries, some scholars suggested that the princes themselves shaped the category to protect their status against other nobles, and to build a stronger basis for their own regional authority. From this angle, rules about how quickly princely fiefs had to be re-granted after a holder's death were interpreted as safeguards that preserved princely continuity and limited royal freedom of action. That idea could then be woven back into the old grand narrative. If royal hands were tied by rules that ensured princes would always be replaced quickly, the monarchy could not build a large unified territory for itself, and the path toward a centralized state would be blocked. The medieval constitution, in that reading, contained a built-in mechanism favouring decentralization. Over time, doubts accumulated. Some historians questioned whether such obligations ever existed as binding imperial law, or whether they were simply customary practices shaped by inheritance expectations and political pragmatism. Others noted that what looks like a legal principle in theory may have operated as a flexible habit in practice, with kings usually granting vacated fiefs to heirs and relatives because that was the easiest way to avoid conflict. At the same time, some scholars argued that the crown could gain advantages from framing relationships in more formal terms because it provided a language for binding princes into the realm and presenting their authority as delegated rather than independent. What had once been described as autonomous lordship could be recast as something that existed within a recognized structure of royal approval, even if the day-to-day reality remained messy. For much of the 20th century, the debate was heavily shaped by legal history, and that dominance was not accidental. The long preoccupation with the absence of a nation-state made constitutional questions feel urgent. Scholars searched medieval documents for the moment when German statehood allegedly failed or took a different direction. Outside Germany, this obsession sometimes looked strange, even unsettling, because it seemed to turn the Middle Ages into a courtroom in which the modern state was always the judge. In the second half of the 20th century, the grip of that approach loosened. Scholars continued to debate legal categories, but they increasingly accepted that medieval evidence does not always support clear definitions. Later, elevations to princely rank, for example, rarely appear as purely legal events. They often depended on political power, reputation, and the interests of other major actors. Recognition could require the right constellation of influence and relationships, not simply a checklist of rights. From this perspective, princely status became less a rigid legal box and more a negotiated outcome, shaped by political realities and acknowledged through ceremonial practice before it was codified in procedure. Prosoepigraphical and social historical research also pushed the discussion in a new direction. Instead of treating a princely class as a fixed legal corporation from an early date, some scholars argued that such a unified body did not truly exist until much later. The people labelled as princes could share certain legal features while remaining socially diverse, with different degrees of power, wealth, and influence. They did not necessarily act together as a class, and they did not consistently confront the king as a united front. Opposition to royal policy tended to occur in specific conflicts rather than as a permanent collective stance. Marriages routinely linked princely families with other high nobles, blurring boundaries that legal definitions tried to draw. From this angle, status mattered at least as much as power. Becoming a prince could mean a rise in honour and rank without immediately transforming the material balance of force. These shifts were reinforced by broader rethinking across medieval studies. The classic picture of a fully formed feudal system, long assumed to be stable and comprehensive, came under pressure. Some researchers argued that the legal framework described in older handbooks was not as early or as universal as once believed. That debate forced a reconsideration of when, how, and why personal obligations and fiefs became central to political description. It also raised new doubts about whether key events of the 12th century were governed primarily by what later generations would call feudal law. The use of Roman legal ideas, often assumed to have transformed politics under Barbarossa, also began to look more limited north of the Alps than older narratives had suggested. Even the basic question of whether a king could impose law effectively across the realm came to be treated with caution. A deeper change followed from these doubts. If medieval rulers did not think in modern categories, did they actually see princes as a structural threat that had to be solved? Older scholarship often assumed that it must have been in the king's interest to build a centralized state, or to restore an earlier form of sovereignty, supposedly inherited from the Frankish past. More recent approaches have questioned that assumption. Many contemporaries did not seek a state in the modern sense at all, and political order could be imagined in multiple ways within the dense web of relationships among rulers and magnates. Fundamental conflict between king and princes did occur, sometimes dramatically, but it was not necessarily the normal condition. Often, royal rule worked within the rivalries of the great, balancing them, mediating disputes, and maintaining authority not by crushing princes but by operating above their conflicts. This change in perspective connects with research that highlights how early medieval kingship often functioned as leadership among peers rather than as command over subjects. The monarch's position could be strengthened only gradually through reputation, negotiation, and the management of honour and alliances. Later crises, especially those surrounding the struggle over appointments in the church, revealed how fragile consensus could become and how quickly political order could fracture. Assemblies held without the king and collective actions by princes showed that leading men could claim to represent the realm itself, even in opposition to the monarch. By the early 12th century at the latest, it was clear that princes were not merely subjects of rule, but participants in rule, shaping decisions, defining limits, and insisting that governance was something done with them, not simply done to them. By the mid-12th century, the German kingdom had settled into a political rhythm that looked different from the clean, centralized monarchies that later became familiar in Western Europe. After a period of transition under earlier rulers, a new phase opened in 1152 with the election of Frederick Barbarossa. From the start, his authority rested on something that contemporaries understood clearly. The realm's greatest men mattered. Their support was not a decorative extra. It was the basic condition of effective rule. Royal charters from this era often present decisions as the product of consultation. That detail is more than formula. It reflects the reality that the ruler's public legitimacy and his practical ability to act were tied to aristocratic agreement. Even the imperial title, with its aura of universal authority, did not float above domestic politics. It depended on the same foundation of recognition at home. When resistance hardened among leading princes, the king could be forced to recalibrate or abandon plans. And yet, Barbarossa was not weak in the way later stereotypes sometimes imply. Compared with some predecessors, he could move decisively against individual opponents when the political conditions allowed it. This raises an important question that modern historians have pressed. If the ruler's standing could appear so impressive to contemporaries, why assume he needed to reform the realm in the manner of a modern state builder? From a 12th century point of view, imperial rule could look magnificent. The court was a magnet. The ruler's honour and the honour of the realm itself served as a driving force in politics. In that world, legitimacy was not measured by bureaucratic centralisation. It was measured by the ability to uphold peace, arbitrate disputes, reward loyalty, punish betrayal, and preserve reputation in the eyes of peers. Once the focus shifts toward honour and negotiated authority, a familiar older storyline begins to fade. For a long time, Barbarossa's reign was explained as a grand clash, Staufen versus wealth, treated almost like a permanent civil war hidden inside the constitution. That framing is much harder to sustain now. Rivalries existed, sometimes bitterly, but they were not automatically the same as universal conflict between king and princes. In many situations, the ruler needed the great men as partners, not as targets. Governance north of the Alps often meant improvisation. Putting out fires, building coalitions, settling feuds, and preventing disputes from turning into open disorder. It was less an engineered system than a continuous practice of conflict management. No episode shows the value of this perspective more clearly than the fall of Henry the Lion. In older retellings, the story is simple. The emperor decides to crush the most dangerous prince, orchestrates a legal process, and breaks apart huge duchies to strengthen the crown. The result becomes proof that Barbarossa was a master strategist reshaping the realm. A closer look produces a different picture. Henry's power in Saxony and Bavaria did not rise in isolation. It grew with royal backing and with the advantages of family ties. The break came when Henry refused to support the emperor's military effort in Italy. Barbarossa's defeat in the North Italian War became a political turning point. But Henry's downfall was not triggered only by the emperor's anger. It was also driven by Henry's relationships on the ground, by pressure from regional rivals, by complaints from other nobles, and by the hostility of powerful church leaders who saw him as a threat to their own position. In this light, the emperor's role looks less like a conductor guiding every note and more like a patron who withdraws protection. Once that protection ended, Henry's enemies could move. They were not simply acting as agents of royal centralization. They were pursuing their own regional struggles. The Duke's methods of organizing his duchy and expanding his influence created a coalition of resistance. Henry was eventually outlawed, stripped of titles and forced into exile. But whether Barbarossa celebrated the long-term weakening of Henry's power as a deliberate grand design is much less certain than older narratives suggested. The episode can be read as the outcome of a collapsing alliance rather than as a blueprint for constitutional reform. This rethinking has consequences beyond one dramatic case. It also reshapes how the emergence of imperial princes is understood. The older search for a single founding moment, a formal act that created a clear legal rank with a clear political goal, has increasingly given way to a slower, more layered story. Instead of a switch being flipped in the 1180s, the evidence points toward gradual differentiation inside the aristocracy. Status hardened over time through practice. Who sat closest to the ruler, who appeared in witness lists, who was treated as indispensable in negotiations, who held the kinds of rights and resources that made them unavoidable in regional politics. That does not mean law was irrelevant. The 12th and 13th centuries show a growing appetite for legal clarity. Relationships that had long been managed through custom and personal ties began to be described more precisely. New legal language, some shaped by developments in Italy, some shaped by the expanding world of learned clerics and trained administrators, offered sharper tools for defining obligations and privileges. Yet it is risky to picture Roman law sweeping north and reorganizing politics overnight. The impulse may have been less about importing a complete system and more about learning to speak more carefully about authority that already existed. When a great lord was elevated in rank and his holdings were treated as a single unified grant, it is tempting to see a rational organizational act at work. The ruler integrating aristocratic power into a neat hierarchy. Some interpretations move in that direction, presenting princely dignity as a way to legitimize high noble lordship and place it within a framework of delegated authority. But there is another possibility that fits the evidence at least as well. The language and ceremonies of elevation gave a refined description to realities that were already taking shape, rather than transforming those realities on the spot. One of the clearest shifts in modern scholarship is the order of cause and effect. Instead of beginning with a basic opposition between king and princes, many historians now treat that opposition as something that became more institutionalized later, after other arrangements failed. In this view, medieval politics allowed multiple configurations. At times, the king acted as arbiter among magnates. At times, the king was also a territorial lord inside the same competitive field, pursuing resources and allies, like other great men. Partnerships, not permanent hostility, often shaped the system. When deep conflict did erupt, it signalled crisis, not the normal operating mode. Barbarossa's reign fits that pattern. For long stretches, the royal court offered prestige, opportunity, and rewards. Its attraction was real, even if it could fluctuate, especially after military reverses in Italy. Meanwhile, the service elites attached to rulers and princes became more visible. But even then, the political relationship remained intensely personal. The king dealt with people, with their loyalties, rivalries, and honour more than with abstract principalities. Institutional thinking existed, but it was still developing. The realm was not a machine. It was a network. At the same time, broader social and economic forces were reshaping the landscape. The 12th century's growth in population and production encouraged land development on a large scale. New clearings, new villages, and expanding cultivation changed what it meant to hold power in a region. As resources increased and competition intensified, boundaries mattered more. Lordship began to be imagined not only as command over people, but also as control over space. That shift did not create modern states by itself, but it nudged politics toward a more territorial vocabulary. This evolution also altered noble families. Earlier medieval kin groups were often flexible networks, not fixed lineages with a single clear centre. Over time, as lordship became tied to specific seats and regions, families took on a different shape. Father-to-son succession gained ideological weight. Castles became not just fortifications but identity markers. A leading residence could lend its name to a lineage, and that name could endure even if the original place was lost. Seals and heraldic symbols helped transform personal identity into dynastic branding, recognizable and inheritable. Church reform interacted with these changes in complex ways. Noble families founded monasteries, endowed them, and sought lasting influence over them. These houses became burial sites, memorial centers, and spiritual partners in the project of dynastic continuity. Prayer for the dead mattered religiously, but remembrance also mattered politically. A family that could present its ancestors as worthy, venerable, and long-standing strengthened its claim to rank. Over time, monasteries produced narratives that preserved and shaped that memory, helping dynasties become not only biological realities, but intellectual constructions. All of this formed the background for what later observers called territorial policy. Yet it is crucial not to project modern long-term planning onto the 12th century. Many princes acted with limited aims, securing inheritances, managing rivalries, protecting honour, expanding resources when opportunities appeared. Some figures went further, attempting more systematic consolidation. But those were exceptions rather than the norm, and in certain cases, pushing too far could provoke the very coalition that brought a prince down. The reshaping of duchies during Barbarossa's reign illustrates this. Partition and the creation of new ducal titles can easily be misread as a deliberate program to destroy older structures. But another reading fits the political logic of the time. These acts were ways to resolve conflicts of rank. In a society where status was a tangible force, ending a feud often required preserving the dignity of multiple parties. Elevating one lord, creating a new title for another, and redrawing jurisdictions could restore balance and consensus. The constitutional consequences were real, but the immediate motivation was often peace between powerful rivals, not abstract statecraft. That perspective also changes how the famous question is approached. Did a modernizing phase occur in the 12th century realm? The answer depends on what modernizing means. If it means bureaucratic centralization and systematic territorial government, then the evidence does not support a clear turning point under Barbarossa. If it means sharper legal vocabulary, more precise descriptions of authority, and a gradual drift toward territorial thinking, then meaningful changes were underway. But these developments were uneven, regionally varied, and driven as much by social practice as by royal design. This brings the story back to how modern historians have interpreted the Middle Ages. Older generations often treated the medieval past as an explanation for modern national outcomes. Success or failure of unity, delay or inevitability of the nation-state, and a unique German trajectory. More recent approaches have been more cautious. They emphasize that medieval actors did not pursue modern goals, that their politics was shaped by honour, negotiation, and crisis management, and that the balance between king and princes shifted over time rather than following a single master plan. Picture a medieval town in Germany, streets tightening around a market, a church tower rising above roofs, and a wall that draws a hard line between insiders and outsiders. It is tempting to imagine such a place as free by nature, a small republic that somehow sprang up apart from noble power. That image survives largely because a handful of famous imperial cities later achieved striking autonomy. But across Germany and across Europe, most towns began and matured on ground shaped by lords, bishops, abbeys, counts, dukes, or kings. Even when a commune gained privileges and a council began to govern, the town usually remained entangled in the wider framework of lordship for a very long time. That entanglement was not abstract. It was personal and everyday. Lords needed local agents to collect dues, oversee justice, manage property, and represent authority. Towns, too, relied on officials who negotiated and argued in the spaces where urban interests met seigneurial power. Between these worlds stood figures such as reeves, bailiffs, and other intermediaries, and on the urban side, councilmen and magistrates who learned how rule worked by dealing with it directly. In many places, the families who rose to prominence inside the walls did not come from nowhere. They often had backgrounds connected to service, people accustomed to the mechanics of governance, used to the language of obligation and privilege, and sometimes trusted as agents of their lord. That experience could give urban elites both the confidence and the know-how to reach beyond the walls. At first glance, it sounds like a contradiction. A community that talks about citizen equality, yet produces leaders who pursue dominance outside the town. The contradiction dissolves once the wall is taken seriously. The wall was not only stone and ditch, it was a legal and social boundary. Inside it, the commune's ideals could be asserted more strongly. Outside it, the countryside remained a different world, one where hierarchy was expected. And even within the town, councils did not govern as pure equals. Municipal order required rank, discipline, and coercion, even if it was expressed through civic forms. Urban lordship in Germany becomes visible most clearly in written records from the 13th century, but it grows much more common later. That timing matters. Early on, what towns held in the countryside was usually fragmented, a patchwork of properties, rents, rights, and occasional jurisdictions. It was not the same thing as a principality, and it rarely carried the same weight. Most urban power beyond the walls was subordinate power, constrained by the claims of princes or church lords. Still, imperial cities had one crucial advantage. Their highest political link ran directly to the king or emperor rather than through a regional lord. That status did not automatically hand them a territory, but it made territorial gains more plausible. In the long run, a minority of imperial cities, something like a tenth, managed to assemble sizable lordships outside their walls. To understand how that happened, it helps to look at medieval urbanization as a process with two faces. The first is internal, the tightening of the urban core, the building of defences, the growth of institutions, the appearance of communal government. The second is external, the spread of urban influence into the surrounding countryside, sometimes as a thin economic shadow, sometimes as the beginnings of political rule. Most towns were not planted on empty land as brand new creations. They usually grew where there was already something worth gathering around. A market, a river crossing, a sacred site, a fortress, a court, an administrative centre. Over time, these places accumulated central functions for the region around them: trade, law, religion, or governance, and that surplus of services is one way to recognise an urban settlement. Older German towns often clustered around bishoprics or early trading and fortress settlements that had already shaped local life before the Great Wave of growth. The 12th and early 13th centuries brought a surge of urban development, but much of it took the form of privilege and enfranchisement, rather than a clean foundation. Lords strengthened their grip on towns even as they granted rights that helped towns thrive. Kings did it too, but so did princes and bishops. The result is a basic coherence. Towns and their hinterlands were tied from the beginning to the structures of lordship. In some regions, rules issued for a lord's dependents reached beyond the central court into the countryside, binding town and periphery through shared obligations and personnel. This mixture created a productive tension. Towns drew people in with the promise of opportunity, better access to markets, better legal standing, and a different social horizon. But towns also attracted lords, because a town concentrated wealth, manpower, and strategic value. In practice, the town became a meeting point between two ambitions: migrants and merchants seeking advantage, and rulers seeking leverage. A town in Alsace offers a vivid example of how these processes could intertwine. In the space between neighbouring ecclesiastical estates, commercial activity and settlement could thicken over generations. Yet the right to command high justice might lie elsewhere, held through advocacy or delegated authority. When a stronger ruler stepped in, whether by takeover, negotiation, or pressure, the emerging town community did not simply free itself. Instead, it navigated a complex field, securing consent, buying and selling communal resources, using revenue to strengthen defences, and gradually converting a loose settlement into a walled commune. In such cases, the town's rise was inseparable from the actions of external powers and the presence of their officials. Growth inside the walls could happen at the same time as the town served as a political stronghold for a dynasty in the region, and municipal autonomy could expand even while the town remained formally tied to royal status. As towns grew, walls were often extended more than once. Suburbs formed, population increased, and the list of urban functions multiplied. Over decades, the city's institutions, council, courts, churches, guilds, hospitals, became more developed, and the town's pull on the surrounding countryside became stronger. Migration records from later centuries sometimes show this clearly, pointing to the town as a destination for rural newcomers and as the economic hub of a broad region. But influence is not yet lordship. The step from being a market centre to being a rural ruler usually began with property. Wealthy citizens and urban institutions acquired land beyond the walls: fields, vineyards, mills, woods, and rights attached to them. Hospitals, monasteries, and friaries often played large roles in this quiet expansion, because they could hold estates and collect revenues. Over time, the council itself sometimes entered the game more directly. Land and rights could be bought, taken as security for loans, or acquired through pledges and mortgages. Money was the key lubricant. Towns generated surplus capital through trade, and aristocrats increasingly relied on cash and credit to administer their own affairs. That need opened doors. A noble house short on liquidity might pawn a right or sell a holding that, in a different financial climate, would have stayed within the family. As these rural footholds multiplied, control began to concentrate. Even when individual citizens or institutions technically held a right, long-term pressure often pushed those external possessions toward municipal oversight. A town that had enough scattered rights could start to coordinate them, setting rules, appointing officials, standardizing dues, and asserting jurisdiction in practice, even if contested in theory. To defend and formalize these gains, towns used a toolbox that blended military, legal, and diplomatic instruments. They could build defensive lines and boundary works that marked a zone of influence. They could make agreements with nearby nobles, securing access to castles in times of danger, or drawing aristocrats into a special relationship with the city that blurred the boundary between town and countryside. They could also pursue broader jurisdiction, especially lower justice, which often followed property over land and people. But these claims frequently collided with princes who saw the same spaces as theirs by right. In many regions, conflicts over rural jurisdiction were not side issues. They were central to what urban power could become. In the background, the most durable instrument was economic gravity. Towns set the terms of trade. Measures, standards, fees, market regulations, and patterns of supply. A city could shape the countryside without formally ruling it by pulling rural production into its market and controlling the rules of exchange. Even when political lordship remained thin, economic dominance could be thick. By the later Middle Ages, some cities pushed far enough to resemble city-states, in everything but name. Nuremberg became the classic case, a large and unusually cohesive urban territory that even included subordinate towns. But Nuremberg was not the default model. A city of similar size, such as Lübeck on the Baltic, followed a different path, less emphasis on building a compact territorial lordship, more emphasis on securing strategic positions along trade routes and maintaining influence through commerce. Cologne, the largest German city of the period, shows another variant: limited political rule over a defined territory, paired with extraordinary economic reach across the surrounding region. In the south, however, the concentration of imperial cities, the intensity of market life, and the density of competing lords created conditions where urban territories could grow more noticeably. Ulm demonstrates what could happen when a city acquired full sets of rural rights through purchase or pawn. In a relatively short span, especially in the late 14th century, such a city could assemble a compact zone around itself, add thousands of dependent villages to its sphere, and govern a countryside that was no longer merely connected to the city by trade, but also by formal obligations. Smaller towns rarely achieved that scale, yet many still developed what might be called rudimentary territories, networks of external possessions and rights that did not amount to full political lordship, but did embed urban people and institutions deeply into rural life. A town like Nördlingen illustrates how constraints could limit civic ambitions. Royal status could exist on paper while the surrounding countryside was effectively controlled by a powerful noble neighbour. In such a situation, citizens and urban institutions might hold many rural properties, but the crucial rights that turn holdings into lordship, high justice, escort rights, full jurisdiction, could remain out of reach. The result was a city with influence and external footholds, but without the complete package of powers that made some southern cities into true rural rulers. Even in very small towns, the pattern could repeat on a miniature scale. A community might remain firmly under noble control, with little autonomy granted by its lord. Yet leading families could still acquire rural estates and manorial privileges outside the walls. Those acquisitions mattered socially and politically. They altered the town's internal hierarchy, strengthened the local elite's ties to countryside resources, and reshaped town-country relations inside a lord's dominion, even when the commune itself remained weak. In the medieval empire north of the Alps, some towns stood in a special relationship to the crown. Their highest lord was not a nearby duke or bishop, but the king or emperor. In theory, that link came with obligations, formal loyalty, taxes, and service when demanded. In return, these towns often gained the strongest kind of legal backing available in the period: written privileges that confirmed markets, toll exemptions, judicial protections, and commercial rights. Yet even this seemingly clear category hides a messy reality. Towns connected to the crown could look nothing alike. Some were small and politically quiet. Others were wealthy, crowded, and ambitious. Some were ruled by tight circles of patrician families. Others became arenas of guild power. Some lived near royal roots and felt the ruler's presence. Others saw the king only rarely and had to rely on their own strength. And the dividing lines were not only constitutional. Population size, economic structure, regional rivalries, and the crown's shifting interests often mattered more than any neat label. Time made the picture even more unstable. A town could gain a reputation for special freedom and then lose it. Status could slide quietly when a ruler pledged a city as security for loans or political support. If a town could not buy itself out, it might be pulled into a prince's growing territory. For many towns, the greatest danger was not an open conquest, but this slow legal capture through mortgages and political bargaining. That raises the deeper question: when did people begin to think of this category as something real and distinct? Modern scholarship tends to treat imperial city as a fixed type, but medieval political language did not always work that way. In the 12th and early 13th centuries, the term itself was not yet a stable constitutional concept. The real consolidation of the idea, and of the political behaviour that went with it, is often placed later, especially in the long transition from the mid-14th into the 15th century, when the empire's internal coordination grew more complex and when cities began to appear as part of the wider political machinery rather than just as local communities. Still, one city sits at the centre of almost every discussion: Nuremberg. But Nuremberg must be treated carefully. It was not typical. It was an outlier that repeatedly turned proximity to royal politics into lasting advantage. The city's unusual standing can be measured by a striking fact. Across many centuries, every crowned ruler of the empire came there at least once. Some arrived again and again, sometimes staying for long stretches. Royal presence became part of the city's identity, and the city shaped its own self-image around that closeness. To understand how Nuremberg reached that position, the story begins before the age of the great Staufen emperors. Around the year 1000, a fortress on a rocky height above the Pegnitz already marked the site. Archaeology suggests early construction well before the mid-11th century. This strongpoint was not born as a free civic centre. It was embedded in noble and royal struggles from the start. In the early 11th century, conflict between ruler and regional magnates helped push the castle into royal hands. It did not remain there unchallenged. The crown could grant, reclaim, or redirect such property, and at one stage Nuremberg was connected to an episcopal sphere rather than standing purely as a royal possession. Under the Salian rulers, however, the balance shifted. Royal power in the region was reorganized, and Nuremberg began to function as a practical hub, useful for overseeing remaining crown assets in a strategically sensitive border zone, where older political units met and where routes to neighbouring regions mattered. The king's court needed places where it could stop, lodge, issue decisions, and project authority. In Nuremberg, that role was anchored by the castle above and supported below by residences and a growing settlement of people who served, supplied, and profited from the court's presence. Ministerial families, merchants, artisans, and others whose livelihoods depended on the flow of authority and trade. Royal visits became frequent enough to reinforce the town's status. The fortress itself likely expanded from a simpler refuge into a more imposing complex. But the same political forces that could elevate the site could also shake it violently. During the last phase of the investiture contest, conflict within the ruling house turned Nuremberg into a target. A siege and capture in the early 12th century left a memory that later writers treated as a turning point. Proof that royal-centred towns could be devastated when dynastic struggles broke open. After the Salian line ended, uncertainty returned. Competing claims followed the succession crisis, and royal elections redirected the flow of favour. Nuremberg's royal connection weakened for a time, then regained strength when the Staufen came to power. In that earlier stage, it makes little sense to draw a sharp legal line between what a dynasty held as family property and what the crown held as public domain. In practice, power moved through people and relationships, not through modern legal categories. By the mid-12th century, the town's internal structure becomes clearer. Royal deputies appear more distinctly. A town count with authority not only inside the settlement, but also across parts of the surrounding countryside, responsible for administration and judicial business. Coinage began to be produced there. Crown servants managed nearby lands, treating them as part of an imperial holding. The settlement expanded and diversified. A Jewish quarter was established in the mid-12th century, and new urban growth on both sides of the river began to reshape the town's plan. South of the Pegnitz, a planned district with more regular streets formed around a royal residence area, showing that this was not merely spontaneous growth, but also shaped by authority and design. The castle complex above likewise developed, and the visible remains of towers and chapels speak to a major building phase. Yet what stands out in this period is how royal authority was deliberately distributed. Instead of allowing one official to accumulate every lever of power, responsibilities were split across several offices. The burgrave, administrative managers of crown land, judicial forums, and later, a sheriff-like figure acting as the ruler's deputy in town justice. This fragmentation served a purpose. A town with strategic value was not to become the private base of a single royal servant who might turn semi-independent. A famous privilege issued in the early 13th century is often remembered as a freedom letter, but its content points in a different direction. Its core was economic and practical. Protections for merchants, rules that reduced legal risks for trade, safeguards for holding and pledging property, and advantages connected to tolls and minting. It also tried to block rival protectors from claiming authority over the town. An important move in a region where bishops and other powers had reasons to press competing rights. Far from announcing that citizens were stepping out from under royal lordship, the document can be read as a tightening of royal control, paired with commercial incentives that made the town more prosperous and more useful to the crown. The one truly forward-looking element lay in taxation, treating the town as a corporate body for fiscal purposes. That subtly encouraged the idea that the community could act as a collective unit. The real shift towards civic self-rule unfolded after the Staufen era ended and royal power weakened. When strong rulers were absent or contested, towns faced two dangers at once. One was disorder in the countryside. The other was political bargaining. A cash-starved king might mortgage a town to secure allies, effectively handing it to a prince as collateral. For a direct royal town, that could be existential. Nuremberg experienced this threat directly when it was pledged into another lord's hands in the late 13th century. If that arrangement had become permanent, the city's later story would have looked entirely different. In this uncertain environment, civic identity sharpened. The citizenry adopted a seal, signalling collective authority. The town begins to appear in records as a unified community. Committees emerge, lay judges who work alongside royal justice, and councillors who represent the town in wider alliances. When Nuremberg joined a league aimed at preserving peace, it was not simply performing a proud act of independence. It was also responding to the vacuum of effective royal enforcement and to the practical need for stability on roads, in trade, and in regional politics. A turning point came with Rudolf of Habsburg's drive to reclaim lost crown holdings. His efforts prevented regional lords from locking certain royal towns into their territories. Yet his policies also carried a price. To reward supporters and stabilize power, he strengthened the position of the burgraves, connected to Nuremberg's fortress. This created a long rivalry between the city and neighbouring territorial lords, who sought to expand their authority at the city's expense. In other words, the same royal strategy could simultaneously protect a town from incorporation and empower a nearby competitor who would pressure it for generations. The 14th century deepened the city's political role. Two rival dynasties, the Wittelsbach and the Luxemburgers, both treated Nuremberg as valuable. The measure is simple. They kept coming back. Repeated royal presence meant repeated opportunities. Privileges granted, disputes arbitrated, offices pledged and redeemed, and the slow transfer of practical powers from royal agents to civic hands. Under Ludwig IV, royal conflict created leverage for towns willing to back him. Nuremberg gained significant concessions, broad toll exemptions that boosted trade, and expansions of the council's judicial influence at the expense of the royal deputy. In this phase, one figure illustrates how power could move: a wealthy citizen financier. By advancing money and services to the ruler, such a man could obtain profitable rights and offices. In Nuremberg, the office of the Imperial sheriff and associated privileges became entangled in pledges, redemptions, and private administration. Over time, the office weakened as an independent royal instrument and drifted into the orbit of the council until the city ultimately gained full control. Inside the walls, governance also consolidated. Earlier bodies of judges and councillors evolved into a more defined council with expanding responsibilities. Municipal regulations multiplied. Specialised offices appeared to supervise markets and business behaviour. A narrow circle of leading families, some rooted in ministerial backgrounds, others enriched through long-distance trade, formed the core of political leadership. Wider councils existed in some form, but the inner council held the real steering power. That concentration did not pass without tension. In the mid-14th century, rising groups inside the town demanded a voice, and the atmosphere was inflamed by imperial politics. A contested throne, rival kings, and shifting allegiances made urban faction lines sharper. In Nuremberg, the crisis did not map neatly onto a simple story of guilds versus patricians. Divisions cut through elite families as well, and alliances could be unexpected. The upheaval of 1348 and 1349 produced a new council that was broader and included artisans as a visible element. Guild organisation gained recognition. Yet the regime that emerged was not a pure artisan takeover. It was a coalition with multiple layers. For a time, the new order functioned and negotiated with the rising royal power. Then, the emperor's position strengthened and the balance shifted. Charles IV ultimately backed the restoration of the old council leadership, invalidated decisions made under the revolutionary regime, and empowered the returning elite to punish opponents. At the same moment, the city witnessed one of the darkest episodes of the age: violence against Jews. A destructive attack and expulsion followed, with hundreds killed and the surviving community driven out. This catastrophe was tied to the broader crisis culture of the period, where political instability, social fear, and the search for scapegoats could converge into mass violence. After order was restored, the patrician leadership reasserted itself. Yet the shock left traces. Even a regime that returned to elite control could find it prudent to widen participation in limited ways, bringing selected artisans into enlarged councils while keeping the highest financial and executive offices in patrician hands. Over time, a deliberate effort also appeared to control memory, suppressing the story of the revolt, reshaping how later generations explained it, and turning a complex political crisis into a simpler moral tale. The resolution of the internal crisis strengthened Nuremberg's bond with Charles IV. The city became a key point in his strategy for linking his power bases across the empire. Symbolic actions underscored its importance. Dynastic ceremonies held in the city, and crucial constitutional measures issued there. The Golden Bull, one of the most consequential legal settlements of the later medieval empire, was connected to Nuremberg in a specific and lasting way. while Frankfurt was confirmed as the site of royal elections and Aachen as the place of coronation. Nuremberg was designated as the location where the newly chosen ruler was to hold his first imperial assembly. This did not make Nuremberg free in a modern sense. It made it central. It turned the city into a stage where royal legitimacy and imperial politics repeatedly had to appear in public. When Charles of Luxembourg's dynasty reached its later phase, the empire's relationship with its leading cities took on a highly symbolic form. In 1423, Charles's second son, Sigismund, made a decision that said a great deal about trust, prestige, and the practical realities of power. He assigned Nuremberg a permanent duty. The city became the official home of the Imperial Regalia. From that point forward, the town was not only hosting rulers and assemblies, it was safeguarding the physical objects that represented the empire itself. And the city's people gained the public responsibility of escorting them whenever a coronation was held. By the late 14th century, many cities in the empire had reached the height of their political confidence. Under Charles IV and in the early years of Wenceslas, urban leagues and city councils could still behave like serious actors on the imperial stage. Nuremberg stood near the centre of that world, favoured by rulers who valued its position, its money, its reliability, and its ability to host imperial business. But the same period also revealed how fragile that standing could be. The ruler's favour was never distributed evenly, and it could be used to balance rival forces against one another. A recurring tension ran through Nuremberg's story. The city's interests collided with those of the burgraves, and later, the margraves from the surrounding region. Both sides competed for recognition, privileges, and the right to shape local authority. Even a ruler who promoted the city could, at moments, support its rivals when dynastic calculations demanded it. In other parts of the empire, the pattern looked familiar. In Swabia, for example, a coalition of imperial cities formed without asking permission from their overlords, reacting to heavy taxation and repeated pledging of towns as financial security. The immediate issue was money and autonomy. The deeper issue was whether a ruler could treat cities as assets to be pawned, while the cities insisted they were political communities, with rights that could not be traded away like property. Urban alliances did not fade away quickly. Even after Wenceslas' election, city coalitions remained active, partly because the crown's weakness encouraged regional conflicts. Princely leagues and urban leagues began to confront each other more openly, and the political temperature rose. Nuremberg often tried to play a calmer role, presenting itself as a mediator between the estates of the realm, even while it reached a peak of influence within its own city alliances. That balancing act could not prevent war. When fighting finally escalated in the late 1380s, early urban successes were followed by a decisive reversal. A coalition of princes defeated the united towns in a major conflict that became a warning sign for the next century. The result was not that cities vanished as powers overnight, but the defeat exposed limits. The dream that towns could stand alongside kings, electors, and great lords as a constitutional force of equal weight began to lose momentum. As the 15th century unfolded, the political landscape hardened. Larger territorial powers gained the advantage, and even strong cities felt increased pressure from neighbouring princes who built regional systems of dominance. Nuremberg remained connected to the crown. Imperial assemblies continued to be associated with the city, and its reputation as a key political venue did not disappear. Yet something changed in tone and practice. Rulers came less often. Assemblies increasingly took place without the monarch being physically present. The crown's ability to project authority through personal visits and direct supervision weakened. That decline created an odd double effect. It reduced the crown's grip on the empire, and at the same time it forced cities to pursue their interests more independently because reliable royal support could no longer be taken for granted. In the first half of the 15th century, Nuremberg experienced mixed fortunes. On one side, the city achieved something that earlier generations would have viewed as a victory of civic consolidation. Through purchases and financial redemptions, the council gradually pushed the influence of its territorial rivals back from within the city's own walls. In 1427, a symbolic moment arrived when the council acquired the remains of the Burgraves' destroyed castle from the Margraves, who held claims over it. The purchase looked like a statement. The city was asserting that its inner space would not be shared with a competing lord. But that victory did not erase conflict. The Margraves did not surrender every claim, and there was enough unresolved authority to produce new confrontations. In 1449, a fresh war broke out after a Margrave launched a feud against Nuremberg. The conflict spread, drawing in wider regions and sharpening the long-running clash between urban autonomy and territorial expansion. Nuremberg itself did not suffer catastrophic consequences, but the wider outcome favoured the territorial side. It became increasingly clear that cities were losing room to manoeuvre in an empire where princes were gaining strength. By mid-century, the earlier story of an inevitable rise toward a stable urban constitutional status looked far less straightforward. Even after 1450, the political place of the imperial city was not secure or fixed in practice. Cities had once imagined themselves acting as independent corporate powers in the realm. That ambition now met hard constraints. A further complication came from the crown's long absences from the empire's core regions. Without consistent royal presence, the everyday relationship between city and crown could thin out, even in places that had once felt close to the monarch. Later in the century, imperial politics shifted again. The crown began to act more actively, and imperial institutions became more demanding. Cities found themselves pulled in multiple directions at once. On one hand, imperial policy required money, troops, and participation. On the other hand, the estates of the empire expected cities to coordinate within the existing political order. Cities responded by organising themselves more regularly. Urban assemblies started to meet alongside imperial gatherings in a more continuous way than the earlier temporary city leagues. Still, joining the empire's central political forums as full participants remained a long road, and progress was uneven. Yet the story of the imperial city cannot be told only through formal structures. Something else was happening at the level of language, identity, and public argument. Over time, the idea of the imperial city became widely accepted as a powerful claim. In 15th century conflicts, Nuremberg sources argued intensely about what the empire truly was and who had the right to speak for it. Opponents mocked city citizens as politically unfit, attacking their status with insults and propaganda. Pro-urban voices answered with a bold reversal. The empire, they insisted, was visible in the policies and armed strength of the cities themselves. The argument was contested, but it shows a major change. The concepts of the empire and the imperial city were becoming sharper, more usable, and more emotionally charged. Late 15th century writers pushed this identity even further. The city's image was crafted as a statement. Nuremberg was presented as wealthy, populous, and fortified, but also marked by unmistakable imperial symbolism. The imperial eagle and the royal castle signalled direct connection to the crown with no intermediary lord. Prominent displays of justice announced delegated authority and municipal jurisdiction. Such imagery did more than decorate a page. It fixed a political message in the viewer's mind. This was a community that ruled in the name of imperial legitimacy. Urban chroniclers then built a deeper narrative foundation under that message. They portrayed Nuremberg not merely as loyal, but as ancient in its imperial bond. They framed local rivals as upstarts, while presenting the citizenry as established and rightful. Some accounts went so far as to push the city's origins far back into Roman imperial times, placing it into an invented continuity of emperors and kings. The point was not accuracy in the modern sense. The point was legitimacy. Nuremberg's status as an imperial city had become a core element of civic identity, something to be defended against powerful neighbours and repeated threats. This leads to a broader insight about the empire itself. In the late medieval world, the empire was not only an institutional machine that imposed clear rules, it was also an argumentative resource. Different sides deployed it as a weapon, depending on circumstance. The same applied to the label imperial city. It was not a single unambiguous constitutional fact. It was a political position that could be defended, attacked, negotiated and used. In legal disputes, diplomatic conflicts, raids, and the regional wars that shook Nuremberg in the 15th and even the 16th century, the city's imperial standing became a sharp tool. It could be invoked to claim protection, to resist territorial domination, and to justify autonomy. While these later struggles unfolded, an earlier transformation in the empire's legal and political language had already been taking shape. In the early 13th century, the crown and the princes began to define their relationship in a more formal written manner than before. Instead of one single foundational agreement, the era saw a sequence of major imperial charters that confirmed privileges and set boundaries. The first of these focused on the church princes. The fact that the emperor chose to confirm this group's position in a grand and solemn form reveals something important. By that moment, the church princes had achieved a distinct status as a recognizable group within the empire. A decade later, broader concessions followed in a second major charter, and then a wider vision of peace and legal order was proclaimed. Ambition, however, did not guarantee implementation. Once the emperor's attention shifted and political conditions changed, enforcing such claims across the northern lands became far more difficult. These great charters were not law codes in the modern sense. They were collective confirmations, privileged statements, and negotiated boundaries. Many of the promised rights already existed in scattered form as individual grants. What changed was not always the substance, but the packaging and the political meaning. Gathering privileges into a general guarantee signalled that an entire group expected equal treatment within its own ranks, and that it could bargain with the crown as a unit. The written form did not simply mirror reality. It also expressed what the group most wanted to secure in practice. For the church princes in particular, these documents show a moment when collective self-understanding strengthened. Their support mattered in royal elections and daily government, and the crown could not ignore that. In return for loyalty and service, they demanded clearer boundaries around tolls, coinage, jurisdiction, and royal encroachment. The crown, seeking stability and support, confirmed many expectations while trying to preserve its own standing. The result was not a neat constitutional settlement that automatically transformed the empire. It was an episode in a continuing struggle to translate power into durable claims. In the late 12th century, a quiet shift in political language began to matter almost as much as armies or castles. The imperial chancery increasingly used the label princeps, and it did so first and most consistently for senior churchmen. This was not just flattery. Titles in medieval documents signalled rank, obligations, and the right to be heard. As the emperors of the Stalin era tried to make authority look more orderly and more predictable, they leaned on ideas that resembled feudal hierarchy. Within that framework, certain leading men became easier to define. Those who held their lands and rights directly from the crown, and who were therefore expected to answer directly to the king or emperor. Over time, this group gained a clearer public identity. The term Imperial Prince gradually came to describe the crown's most immediate vassals, people whose bond to the ruler was not filtered through another lord. Yet it was the church princes who formed the earliest and most coherent bloc within that emerging category. They did not present themselves simply as obedient subjects. They increasingly spoke and acted as participants in the empire itself, claiming a place within imperial authority rather than beneath it. In the early 13th century, their collective stance was visible in the way they described their own position. They were portrayed as components of the empire's body, figures entitled to a share in decision-making and status. To belong to the church side of this princely world required more than noble birth or regional power. It required the clerical condition and an office that placed a man at the head of a major ecclesiastical institution. The exact rank inside the clergy mattered less than the fact of ordination and governance. Beyond that, the institution itself needed to be understood as standing in a direct relationship to the empire, at least in the political legal thinking of the time. On that basis, all archbishops and bishops whose core territories lay within the empire could be counted among these princes. Their number was substantial. Alongside a handful of powerful archbishops and many bishops, the group also included heads of certain monasteries and important church foundations that were considered directly tied to the emperor. Even contemporaries sometimes disagreed over which houses truly qualified, but the overall scale remained striking. Across the later Middle Ages, despite political changes and shifting borders, the approximate number of these ecclesiastical princes stayed remarkably stable. Their weight in the political map did not come from sheer territorial size. On average, secular princes tended to command larger blocks of land. Church princes, by contrast, governed a smaller share of imperial territory. Yet, their institutional presence was dense and influential. They were more numerous, often better integrated into imperial politics, and in many regions they formed a network of power that could not be ignored. The most important figures among them were the bishops and archbishops, and their style of rule differed from that of lay princes in ways that shaped everything from court culture to administration. A spiritual principality did not pass from father to son. It did not produce a dynastic household with a spouse, heirs, or a family strategy built around marriage and inheritance. Its ruler was chosen through election, and that single fact changed the entire rhythm of politics. There could be no underage successor ruling through guardians. There could be no division of a bishop's lands among children, because the core property was treated as belonging to the church office rather than the individual. When a bishop died, the principality did not split. It waited, sometimes uneasily, for the next office holder. That arrangement had advantages and risks. A bishop could be removed more easily in principle than a hereditary lord, because he was an office holder. But elections could also produce conflict. Rival candidates, competing factions, and long delays could leave a region uncertain, governed by temporary arrangements and contested authority. Continuity depended less on bloodline and more on the institutions around the bishop. The bishop's responsibilities were also different. A lay prince might claim broad custom and inherited right. A bishop had defined duties tied to a sacred office. Within the diocese, he carried authority to lead the religious community, supervise teaching and discipline, and performed sacred functions that only a bishop could carry out. These were not optional. They were built into the job. At the same time, the bishop also ruled a secular territory that was separate from the spiritual map of the diocese. That dual role created a distinctive kind of power: spiritual authority on one side, territorial lordship on the other. The two could be kept apart in theory, but in practice they often influenced each other. Spiritual influence could serve political goals, and political control could shape religious life. The diocesan side created opportunities that lay princes did not have. Church courts and church administration widened the bishop's legal reach and produced steady sources of income. Fees, fines, and payments associated with ecclesiastical governance could supplement revenue from land and rights. The need to manage a diocese also encouraged a more complex administrative structure than many secular courts developed at the same time. Regular gatherings of clergy linked the bishop and his officials to local office holders across the diocese. Great church ceremonies and major festivals could serve as moments of connection and control, drawing people into the bishop's orbit and turning spiritual life into an instrument of governance. Rules issued for the diocese shaped relationships among bishop, clergy, and lay society in a way that did not have a direct mirror at secular courts. The territorial side, however, looked far more familiar. Here, bishops acted like other princes, competing over borders, rights, and influence. In land disputes, they behaved as peers among lay rulers. The slow process of turning scattered rights into stronger territorial control followed broadly similar tracks: courts, tolls, castles, jurisdiction, and the gathering of revenues. Yet the most dramatic bureaucratic growth often remained concentrated in diocesan administration, rather than in the secular management of territory. The church side tended to institutionalize earlier and more deeply. A major difference inside a bishop's principality was the cathedral chapter. This was not a decorative body. It could become a political force with leverage over the bishop's election and the conditions of his rule. Over time, chapters increasingly bound future bishops with written promises that limited freedom of action. During vacancies, chapters often carried governing responsibilities, providing continuity while the principality waited for a new ruler. The bishop could not treat the principality as personal property in the way a lay prince might imagine his lands. Consultation, scrutiny, and shared authority were built into the structure. Because of this, the bishop's court often had a larger staff and a clearer hierarchy of offices. Clerics filled many positions, and some offices were reserved for them alone. Alongside secular officials similar to those found at lay courts, there existed additional figures suited to church administration, including deputies who managed diocesan business and exercised authority in the bishop's name. Written communication, delegated responsibility, and defined competences became more prominent. As administration hardened into institution, officials gained greater autonomy, and bureaucracy could shape policy as much as personal favour did. The bishop's residence also tended to be more firmly anchored to place. A cathedral could not travel. Relics, tombs, sacred spaces, and the chapter's life fixed the centre of authority in a particular town. The bishop might have secondary residences that looked like princely castles, but the core of rule clustered around the cathedral complex, the administrative buildings, the church court, and the clerical quarter. This created a distinctive urban topography, a spiritual capital embedded inside a city, sometimes cooperating with the city's citizens and sometimes colliding with them. Conflict was common. A bishop's principality could be attacked like any other. Local nobles might try to seize influence by controlling key church positions and benefices. In later centuries, neighbouring secular princes in some regions tried to bring bishoprics into their orbit, by building systems of control over church appointments and court politics. When that happened, a bishop's direct relationship to the empire could be weakened. Meanwhile, bishops frequently clashed with the citizens of their cathedral cities. In some places, tensions became so severe that the bishop's court left the city, either by force or by choice, relocating to another residence and turning former cooperation into lasting hostility. Another pressure came from the papacy. Earlier interventions often aligned with conflicts between pope and emperor, but later financial demands and stronger papal control over appointments increasingly reached into the empire's dioceses, reshaping local realities. The existence of a large class of ecclesiastical princes was unusual in medieval Europe. Clergy elsewhere held land, yes, and churchmen elsewhere exercised authority. But a broad system of territorial rule by bishops on this scale emerged most clearly in the empire and in the Pope's own lands in Italy. The roots of the empire's distinctive pattern lay in earlier centuries, in the way rulers and high churchmen became entangled in governance long before the Staufen Age. The material base mattered first. Bishoprics accumulated estates, rights, and immunities over time. Gifts from rulers expanded these holdings, and privileges could include forest rights, tolls, coinage, markets, and freedom from outside courts. In older Romanized regions, bishops had already taken on certain civic functions and forms of authority, especially as imperial structures weakened. Church wealth grew through donations and through investment of offerings into lands that produced reliable income. Still, this alone did not create the empire's later structure. The decisive turn came in the 10th and 11th centuries. In the East, Frankish and then German kingdom, bishops became unusually valuable to rulers. They served at court, supported military efforts, hosted the ruler's entourage, and carried out diplomatic tasks. They also became crucial in government itself, advising and acting as representatives of royal power. In return, they received extraordinary rewards: property, rights, and the administration of important resources. Some archbishops took on major roles in the realm's political machinery. And in royal elections, bishops were not background figures. They were key players. Rulers also claimed strong authority over the church. Over generations, kings and emperors asserted the right to shape ecclesiastical policy, preside over councils, and influence appointments. Under the Ottonians and Salians, this control became even more pronounced. Many bishops rose from the ruler's own chapel staff, drawn from the king's environment and elevated as trusted men. The logic was straightforward. A bishop given power by the ruler was expected to repay it with loyalty and service. Similar patterns existed elsewhere in Europe, but in the German kingdom the scale and intensity were distinctive. For a long time, historians tried to describe this as a coherent system, as if it were planned and uniform. The reality was messier. Yet the basic outcome is hard to deny. Bishops became central figures in the realm's political order. This prominence reshaped ideals of what a bishop should be. The political bishop emerged as a recognizable type. A churchman who moved inside court culture, spoke the language of governance, and carried responsibility far beyond the altar. At the same time, new reform movements challenged this model. Criticism grew louder against church offices treated as property, against buying positions, against family favoritism, and against bishops acting like secular lords first and shepherds second. Reformers pushed pastoral duty and spiritual discipline to the front. Meanwhile, another power inside the cathedral grew steadily: the cathedral chapter. What began as a small circle of clerics around the bishop's church developed into a formal institution with its own finances, rules, and influence. Over time, The chapter's resources were separated from the bishop's household, and the canons became not just liturgical functionaries, but administrative and political actors. Their participation increased as church and territorial administration became more complex. Eventually, they gained stronger tools to shape elections and constrain bishops through written conditions. These pressures fed into the great turning point of the 11th and early 12th centuries, the conflict over investiture. The question was not simply ceremonial. It was about who had the right to place men into sacred office and by what symbols. The settlement eventually reached did not remove the ruler from the process. It reshaped the process. The ruler no longer conferred the spiritual signs of office, but remained present at elections and continued to grant the secular rights attached to the office. The relationship between emperor and bishop was redefined. It no longer rested mainly on the old notion of a ruler directing the church as a sacred superior. It increasingly resembled a legal bond in which the bishop, as ruler of a territorial church institution, received temporal rights from the emperor. As legal thinking developed in the Stalin period, this temporal grant was often interpreted through a feudal lens. The bishop's worldly authority came to be viewed as something received from the ruler in a structured relationship of obligation. In that view, church property was not treated as freely disposable royal property. The emperor claimed overlordship through legal forms rather than direct ownership. Even ceremonial distinctions expressed the difference between church and lay princes. The concepts of hierarchy and rank were refined, and in many contexts, church princes were placed ahead of secular princes in prestige. By the mid-13th century, the centre of gravity in church politics had moved. Senior churchmen still appeared at royal gatherings, but their real energy increasingly flowed into the lands they controlled on the ground. In earlier centuries, an archbishop or bishop could look like a figure orbiting the monarch. Now, the same men were more likely to be found building authority at home, pushing their claims in courts, reorganizing revenues, and treating territory as something that could be shaped, guarded, and expanded. Modern labels like Prince Bishop and Prince Abbot were coined much later, yet the reality they describe was already taking form. Church leaders acting as territorial rulers inside the empire's political landscape. This change was part of a broader transformation. Across the empire, many rulers were trying to turn scattered rights into something more solid, a defined zone of control, clearer income streams, more predictable courts, and stronger administrative routines. Ecclesiastical princes were not outside this process. They competed within it. Like their lay counterparts, they sought to gather land, jurisdiction, and dues into tighter bundles, and they increasingly spoke of these possessions as their own land, not merely a patchwork of older entitlements. At the same time, their style of governance remained dual. Spiritual administration had long traditions and well-developed routines, but now a more systematic management of secular holdings grew alongside it. Not overnight, and not evenly, but steadily enough to change what power looked like. A crucial step in this consolidation was breaking the grip of external protectors and agents who had once spoken for churches and acted in their name. In many regions, the old practice of lay advocates had become a political tool that allowed kings and nobles to insert themselves into ecclesiastical institutions. Over time, these advocate roles hardened into hereditary positions. Churchmen might once have chosen or negotiated with such figures, but increasingly they faced families who treated advocacy as property. Reform movements had criticized this for generations, yet the practical turning point came later. During the 13th century, bishops and other church rulers in many parts of the empire finally managed to reclaim these offices or neutralize them. As this happened, the advocate's role shrank, then disappeared in large areas. The effect was not abstract. It reduced the ability of secular powers to raid church income, interfere in administration, or use protector roles as a doorway into territorial control. That did not mean church territories became safe or uncontested. Influence from regional nobles remained strong, especially in the appointments that mattered inside cathedral institutions. Positions attached to cathedral chapters were often prizes in local aristocratic competition, and they could shape elections and policy long after advocates had faded. The moment of greatest vulnerability came when an episcopal throne stood empty, or when an election was disputed. In those intervals, rights could be pawned, lands mortgaged, and income streams promised away. The late Middle Ages saw many bishoprics burdened by debt built up through exactly these pressures: costly conflicts, unstable transitions, and the need to secure allies with money or privileges. Another challenger grew within the bishop's own city. From the 12th century onward, communal movements in cathedral towns became a powerful force. Burghers organized, demanded liberties, controlled markets, and fought for their own courts and councils. The bishop's residence city, which might once have seemed naturally obedient, became an arena where authority could be negotiated down or openly resisted. In many places, the bishop lost ground, sometimes dramatically. Even when he retained formal rights, he often had to accept constraints, concessions, or compromises that limited his freedom of action. At the same time, lay princes were not idle. Many secular rulers sought to tighten their hold over church life inside their own regions. Control over appointments, influence over cathedral chapters, and pressure on elections could turn a bishopric into something close to a satellite of a neighbouring principality. In extreme cases, even the basic status of a bishopric could be questioned. Whether it owed direct loyalty to the empire, whether its borders should be redrawn, whether it should be treated as part of someone else's territorial programme. The map of ecclesiastical lordship was therefore never simply a result of church policy. It was shaped by surrounding powers pressing from every side. This is why ecclesiastical territories developed so unevenly. Some started with strong endowments, others with modest resources. Some had capable administrators and unusually skilled bishops, others suffered under weak leadership or prolonged crises. Chance mattered, but so did geography and neighbours. A church ruler's opportunity to purchase a castle, absorb a lordship, or secure a town depended heavily on who stood next door and what pressures they applied. The 13th century, more than any other, set the long-term direction. It was the period when many church territories either found the means to harden into durable lordships, or became trapped in patterns of dependency and vulnerability that were difficult to escape. Even so, later centuries showed that ecclesiastical territories were not automatically doomed to stagnation. Many of them became sophisticated political players and functional states within the empire's structure. Their distinctive position remained a defining feature of the German imperial world, until the sweeping secularizations of the early 19th century finally dismantled most church lordship as a territorial system. Against this broader background, the Archbishopric of Mainz stands out as a central case. From the formation of the East Frankish and then German kingdom onward, the archbishops of Mainz ranked among the most influential figures in imperial politics. Their strength drew partly from geography. Mainz sat within a core corridor of power along the Rhine. It also drew from reputation. The memory of early missionaries and the symbolic prestige attached to Mainz helped make its bishopric a magnet for authority. Over time, Mainz acquired a special role in royal transitions. even when the ceremony of crowning shifted to another archbishopric. Mainz retained commanding influence over the process that mattered most, preparing and steering the election itself. As elections became the key act of legitimacy, Mainz's political leverage increased. This power did not rest on a single foundation. It was supported by material resources, legal privileges, and symbolic standing, all concentrated in one person whose identity fused spiritual office and territorial rule. Yet Mainz also carried a structural weakness common to church principalities. Leadership did not pass along a bloodline. Every new archbishop had to rebuild networks, secure loyalty, and assert authority again. The institution could be powerful, but continuity was always fragile. Mainz also operated in a crowded neighbourhood. Along the Rhine were multiple elector-level powers competing with one another. In such a region, no single player could easily dominate the rest. Mainz's influence therefore rose through skillful positioning, alliances and timing, not through simple hegemony. As a church official, the Archbishop of Mainz presided over a vast ecclesiastical sphere. Mainz's metropolitan reach was extraordinary by northern standards, stretching across wide zones of the empire and linking regions with different histories, languages, and settlement patterns. The archbishop supervised subordinate bishops, confirmed their elections, and convened major synods that set norms and enforced discipline. He also served as a conduit between Rome and the episcopal world under his influence, passing instructions and information along the chain. Certain marks of office signalled this status, including the special garment granted by the Pope that authorised metropolitan rights and carried with it an oath of loyalty. Contemporaries often spoke of Mainz as the leading bishopric of the German lands. This was more a matter of honour and perception than a formal command over other archbishops. Rivals challenged the claim, and it did not automatically translate into jurisdiction across the entire Transalpine Church. When Mainz archbishops held special commissions from Rome, their authority could expand for a time, but permanent delegation of papal power was not something the Curia was willing to grant. Rome preferred control to intermediaries. Within his own diocese, the archbishop was the highest spiritual authority. Teacher, judge, administrator, and the figure responsible for moral and institutional discipline. He could visit parishes personally or through deputies, enforce church law, and oversee local clergy. Over time, inspection routines developed into regular courts that monitored conduct and standards at the parish level. Because Mainz's territories were wide and scattered, intermediate administrative districts became essential, with local church institutions serving as the skeleton of governance. These ecclesiastical structures also supported secular power, because networks that could move information, collect dues, and enforce decisions had obvious value beyond purely religious life. Mainz's imperial role extended far beyond the diocese. Although earlier privileges connected to coronation ceremonies were curtailed and shifted, Mainz retained powerful influence over elections and political choreography. Elections were often staged in locations linked to Mainz's authority, and the archbishop's precedence in voting became a repeated theme in reports. Alongside this, Mainz carried prestigious court titles that signalled closeness to the monarchy, and rulers repeatedly used Mainz and its region as venues for major assemblies and public displays of authority. Grand festivals, political gatherings, and ceremonial moments reinforced Mainz's place near the centre of imperial life. The relationship between the German monarchy and the Imperial Church remained strong after the settlement of the investiture crisis, but it changed in character. The compromise separated spiritual office from the grant of secular powers associated with it. Bishops gained greater independence in church appointments, while rulers continued to confer the worldly rights tied to the office. This arrangement strengthened the princes of the church. They kept secular lordship, now received in a formalized way, while royal appointment to spiritual office was removed. The result was greater freedom of action for archbishops, especially when they were capable enough to use it. Yet imperial politics remained dangerous. Aligning against a powerful ruler could bring swift consequences. Mainz archbishops were deposed, imprisoned, or forced into exile in different periods, depending on the wider struggle between empire and papacy and the shifting alliances inside the Reich. Some archbishops pursued aggressive fiscal policies to finance imperial campaigns and provoked local revolt. In Mainz itself, burdens and exactions could ignite violence. Rival factions within the elite added another layer of instability, especially when rising service families competed with older groups for power and status. Periods of schism amplified these conflicts. When empire and papacy clashed, local dioceses could split as well, with competing claimants, rival loyalties, and absentee leadership. Some archbishops spent long stretches away, moving with imperial courts in Italy and leaving local administration strained. Settlements at the European level could restore order, but the damage from years of division often lingered. Even so, skilled archbishops could return, recover lost rights, and rebuild authority, balancing service to the emperor with the defense of their own institutional interests. The turn of the 13th century brought Mainz into an era of extraordinary influence, shaped in part by the repeated rise of one noble family to the archiepiscopal throne. Over successive reigns, Mainz archbishops became decisive brokers in royal politics. At the same time, the electoral process itself narrowed. Out of earlier, broader participation, an exclusive committee of 7 electors emerged, with Mainz at its head. This development did not happen in a vacuum. Contested elections and rival kings pushed princes to seek stronger rules of legitimacy, and the papacy became an important reference point in arguments over who had the right to elect. In this climate, Mainz archbishops repeatedly acted as kingmakers. One could switch sides when it suited the balance of power, working with Rome at one moment and with a dynasty at another, then crowning or promoting candidates until the realm accepted them. Later, Mainz could also lead opposition, sponsoring anti-kings against rulers viewed as unacceptable. The archbishop's office became a lever through which larger political coalitions could be organised. After the interregnum period, when royal power weakened and the realm drifted, the electors tightened their grip. The choice of king increasingly rested on their decision alone. Once a strong monarch appeared, electors often worked to prevent the crown from turning into a hereditary possession of one house. Their strategy was calculated. Pick candidates from different families, sometimes favouring weaker figures, then extract concessions before the election. The electoral throne became a negotiation table. Mainz archbishops exploited this landscape with varying success. One could block a dynastic succession, then later help remove a king who grew too independent, then turn again to another dynasty when the balance shifted. This high-stakes manoeuvring could bring short-term gains, but also military danger. When an archbishop challenged a confident king and lost, the consequences could be brutal. Defeats in the field, forced treaties, and political humiliation. Even then, setbacks could be temporary. A new election could restore Mainz's influence almost overnight if circumstances favoured it. In the early 14th century, another change began to reshape Mainz from a different direction. Growing papal control over appointments and finances. An archbishop could now arrive not through local election, but through papal decision. This was not merely a matter of prestige. It signalled a broader centralisation in which Rome increasingly claimed the final say, sometimes overriding local choices. Alongside this came financial demands tied to vacancies and appointments. Payments required by the curia could burden a diocese heavily, provoke resentment among local clergy, and weaken an archbishop's room to manoeuvre. Dependence on papal confirmation and papal finance could also complicate imperial politics, because an archbishop's freedom to act as a political broker was constrained when his position rested on a distant authority with its own priorities. Papal appointment powers became a political lever most clearly along the Rhine, because the three great archbishops there also held electoral votes and could tilt the balance in royal elections. In Mainz, up to the outbreak of the Great Western Schism in 1378, choosing a new archbishop rarely remained a purely local matter. It unfolded at the intersection of papal ambition, repeated phases of hostility between emperor and pope, and the rivalry of dynasties that were powerful enough to be considered royal candidates. At the same time, the cathedral chapter was not a neutral referee. It was an arena dominated by regional noble families, each with its own alliances, and those internal factions regularly backed one imperial camp against another. A telling early episode came with Peter of Aspelt. The chapter had split into hostile camps and produced competing results, a sign of deep political division rather than a simple procedural accident. The Pope seized that opening and imposed a third figure to break the deadlock. Yet once installed, Peter did not behave like a mere instrument of Rome. In the decisive electoral moments of 1308 and 1314, he acted with striking independence, and later memory cast him as a figure who had helped place crowns on multiple rulers. His funerary imagery in Mainz Cathedral projected exactly that claim: the archbishop as a kingmaker, a man whose hand belonged to the drama of succession rather than to quiet diocesan routine. That tension between papal control and local resistance resurfaced again and again across the 14th century. More than once, the cathedral chapter's choice collided with Rome's preferred candidate. In 1320, the Pope intervened again, overriding the chapter and forcing a different outcome. The chapter's nominee, already a powerful archbishop elsewhere, withdrew when papal confirmation failed to arrive. The figure who eventually gained broad acceptance initially followed the line Rome expected, aligning with the Habsburg camp. But beneath those formal decisions was the larger fracture opened by the royal double election of 1314 and the bitter contest between rival kings. As the conflict deepened, the papacy treated the archiepiscopal throne of Mainz as a strategic prize. Controlling Mainz meant shaping the electoral field itself. For a time, the last appointment imposed by Rome passed without open rebellion from the chapter, but that calm did not last. The next clash was sharper and more symbolic. When the chapter once again elected the same prominent outsider it had preferred earlier, the message was unmistakable. Mainz's canons intended to defend their electoral rights against a practice that reduced them to spectators. They could not realistically expect the Pope to accept the outcome, yet they were willing to force the confrontation. Rome replied with a hard choice of its own, appointing a loyal supporter with powerful family connections and demanding obedience across the wider ecclesiastical province. The result was open refusal. Most of the cathedral chapter, along with the chapter's elected candidate, rejected the papal nominee and refused to submit. The papal appointee withdrew at first, leaving the archdiocese in a condition that felt like suspended time, a church government split by incompatible claims. But the curia pressed the matter through legal action, and the pressure escalated from judicial procedure to spiritual weapons. Excommunication and interdict followed. measures designed to isolate the opposition and make day-to-day church life unbearable. Under that weight, the chapter's candidate eventually abandoned his claim. Not because he had lost the argument in Mainz, but because Rome had made the cost of resistance too high for the province as a whole. Even then, the story did not settle into a clean victory for papal authority. The papal nominee's position improved only after an abrupt political shift. The archbishop altered his allegiance and reached an understanding with the emperor he had previously opposed. That realignment changed the calculation inside Mainz. The chapter recognized him after extracting major concessions, and the conflict quieted on the surface. Yet the new archbishop now found himself caught in the same trap that had destroyed his rival. Once he had defied papal expectations by cooperating with the emperor, Rome turned its sanctions against him as well. Suspension from office followed, and the Pope declared in advance that the right to decide the next succession would be reserved to the Curia. In Mainz, appointments had become a battlefield where obedience could change within months, and where the same person could be treated first as a papal solution, and then as a papal problem. As imperial alliances shifted again, a new plan took shape to place a Luxembourg on the throne. The former opponent of papal policy now signalled a willingness to cooperate with the Curia in shaping the next royal election. Meanwhile, the sitting archbishop remained loyal to the emperor and resisted the Luxembourg turn. That choice proved expensive in both institutional and territorial terms. At the moment, Mainz was weakened by internal division. The wider ecclesiastical map itself was altered. Important dioceses were detached from Mainz's province, reducing its reach and prestige. Then came the decisive blow. After renewed proceedings and repeated summonses, the archbishop was formally removed from office, replaced by a new appointee installed through papal authority. The deposed archbishop refused to vanish. He held pockets of support within the archdiocese and resisted the replacement for years. Mainz lived through a prolonged schism in practice, with rival obediences and contested control. Only after long exhaustion did the split end. Even then, papal provisions did not disappear. They returned again after the next long archiepiscopate, triggering yet another fracture. Imperial power now entered the scene more forcefully as well. A ruler who wanted a compliant elector in Mainz pressed the papacy to choose accordingly. The cathedral chapter, tied to other political aims, backed a rival figure. The archdiocese once more became an arena where royal ambition, papal appointment policy, and local noble networks collided. By the late 1370s, however, the terrain changed. A successful royal election was followed by the death of the emperor and, almost immediately, the outbreak of the Great Western Schism. The division within the wider church weakened the Curia's ability to enforce centralized policies with the same confidence. The brief period of near-dominant imperial control ended, and the influence of Rhineland electors began to rise again. In Mainz, the internal balance of power shifted back toward local elites. Decisions about leadership and the distribution of authority increasingly returned to the cathedral chapter and the regional noble groups from which it drew its membership. That cathedral chapter had been growing into a power in its own right for centuries. By the 11th century, it had developed as a corporate body with its own wealth and administrative identity, operating alongside episcopal governance rather than inside it. It held assemblies, issued regulations for its members, used a seal, and relied heavily on written administration. Over time, a social transformation reshaped the chapter's character. The old ideal of a communal, clerical life faded. Senior canons demanded privacy and comfort, and many held multiple benefices in different places, making regular residence unrealistic. Attempts to enforce strict presence requirements failed. By the mid-13th century, the chapter had become a mobile, aristocratic institution more than a disciplined community, bound to a single routine. The chapter also acquired mechanisms to control its own composition. Papal privileges allowed it to expand its ranks, with the archbishop required to confirm admissions. Entry was not open to any educated cleric. Candidates needed ordination at least to a lower level, but most stopped short of full priesthood, which suited an aristocratic lifestyle that increasingly resembled secular noble life in manners and expectations. Since this created shortages for liturgical duties, specific priestly positions were added, and those priest canons carried a stricter obligation to reside. Over time, membership was fixed at a defined number, and access was narrowed further by explicit social requirements. A rule was introduced that effectively reserved the chapter for men of knightly ancestry. The aim was not only social exclusivity, but political security. Urban citizens were seen as opponents of clerical privileges, and admitting them into the chapter would have brought the city's conflicts into the heart of the church's governing elite. The outcome was predictable. Mainz's cathedral chapter became a preserve of regional nobility, an institution that anchored aristocratic power inside an ecclesiastical framework. The chapter's most important privilege was the election of the archbishop. Earlier ideals that a bishop should be chosen by clergy and people had already broken down long before. By the 13th century, cathedral canons became the sole electors, and that right was recognized both by rulers and by the church's own councils. Even the later spread of papal provisions could not erase the fact that the chapter understood election as its defining role, and over time it fought to defend that role whenever the curia tried to bypass it. Election was only one part of the chapter's influence. It increasingly demanded a share in governance itself. Cooperation with the archbishop's policies became concentrated around the chapter, pushing other clerical groups to the margins. Certain actions required chapter approval to be valid, including important incorporations and clerical taxation. The chapter also secured leverage in territorial rule through pre-election promises demanded from candidates. Early versions of these promises included limits on debt and taxation without the chapter's consent. Later, capitulations grew more detailed. They required protection of chapter rights, settlement of financial burdens inherited from previous reigns, and confirmation of privileges that shaped the chapter's autonomy. Some agreements even ensured access to castles and fortified places and defined the chapter's role during vacancies or incapacity, when it could effectively act as a guardian of the archbishop's secular authority. Because the canons were nobles, their decisions mirrored the region's aristocratic networks. Patronage, clientage, and family alliances mattered for admissions, elections, and political strategy. Imperial party divisions were reflected inside the chapter. Certain families supplied multiple canons over long stretches, with only brief interruptions, while others appeared rarely. The geographic pattern was also revealing. Areas close to Mainz and its immediate hinterland supplied most members, while distant regions under Mainz's spiritual jurisdiction were largely absent. The real power centre was not the full reach of the diocese on paper, but the dense noble world around the Rhine-Main corridor that fed the chapter and shaped its ambitions. This aristocratic core interacted with the archbishop's secular lordship. Like many imperial churches, Mainz's territorial rights had deep roots in grants made by earlier emperors, who used bishops as a counterweight against unruly nobles. Over the long run, that produced substantial church territories that outlasted the medieval world itself. Yet Mainz's secular holdings were never as coherent as the enormous spiritual province it oversaw. Mainz ruled scattered islands of authority rather than a compact bloc. Those pieces lay within the diocese and sometimes beyond it, and their separation created administrative difficulty and constant vulnerability. Open flanks invited pressure from neighbours. Holding such a principality together required continual bargaining, military readiness, and administrative improvisation. Royal politics offered chances to expand. Loyal service could bring major acquisitions, including monasteries and valuable towns that strengthened Mainz's position in key regions. Dynastic extinctions offered tempting prizes as well, and Mainz, archbishops tried to claim fiefs and inheritances when powerful houses died out. Sometimes they gained footholds but failed to secure long-term control against stronger claimants. Treaties could convert a loss into a formalized relationship, turning disputed lands into fiefs held from Mainz rather than independent territory. Even so, conflicts in regions like Hesse and Thuringia dragged on for generations. Along the Rhine and in core districts, Mainz also had to defend its claims militarily against neighbouring counts. By the end of the 13th century, the broad outline of Mainz's late medieval secular territory had taken shape, concentrated in a few strong zones, with additional outposts farther away. Yet one crucial element slipped away: the city of Mainz itself. The metropolis that gave the archbishopric its name increasingly behaved as a political actor with its own interests, and that shift weakened the archbishop's ability to treat the city as an unquestioned centre of rule. Promises made during royal elections sometimes brought Mainz extensive rewards, including claims over imperial lands and territories held by rivals. Yet such gains could be temporary. Over time, Mainz lost several Western acquisitions to powerful neighbours. The pattern of the later Middle Ages became harsher. After a phase of expansion in the 13th century, Mainz's fragmented and militarily weaker principality suffered setbacks against rising territorial states. Internal schisms made the situation worse because rival archbishops could split loyalties among castles, officials, and noble followers. Beneath all this lay a structural disadvantage. An elective principality led by changing families and shifting coalitions faced a different challenge than a lay principality ruled by a stable dynasty. In theory, an elector archbishop possessed broad regalian rights: justice, markets, minting, tolls, escort rights, and control of fortresses. In practice, the value of such rights depended on whether they could be enforced on the ground. A single toll station could become a financial engine if secured and protected. 1. Major Rhine toll in particular became an exceptional source of revenue for Mainz, obtained through political leverage in royal elections and defended through long-term strengthening of local rights, the suppression of rivals, and the building of a strategically placed castle. Such income mattered even more because Mainz never developed a fully centralized financial administration in the late Middle Ages. The Principalities' wide dispersal made unified accounting and control difficult, and modern reconstruction of its total revenues remains nearly impossible. The court itself can only be sketched for early phases. Honorary high offices existed as elsewhere and were held hereditarily by noble families, more ceremonial than administrative. What is easier to trace is the territorial administration. Early vicariates emerged as intermediate layers between archbishop and local lordships, centred in Mainz and key regional hubs. Over time, some of these arrangements decayed, especially where offices became hereditary possessions without real function, or where cities seized key rights of lordship for themselves. Elsewhere, they remained important, particularly in judicial work, public security, and the leadership of military contingents. As administration expanded, many smaller offices grew around castles, staffed by officials responsible for dues, defence, and local courts. Fiscal districts did not always match administrative districts because revenue collection followed practical lines, rather than neat jurisdictional maps. A common practice of the time further shaped governance. Many rights were effectively leased out to officials in return for fixed payments. This increased cash flow and rewarded service, but it also reduced direct control until an office term ended. In a world without sharply mapped borders, lordship was less a matter of geometric territory than of personal ties. Influence formed through circles of vassals, servants, and followers that could be strengthened or weakened quickly. In this environment, castles were decisive. They were not only military bases but administrative anchors, points from which authority radiated into surrounding countryside. Mainz archbishops used several strategies to control castles. Building and staffing new princely castles was expensive and therefore relatively rare. More typical was binding existing castles through feudal ties, granting them to knightly vassals in exchange for service. Influence could also be obtained without full vassalage, by securing rights of access during feuds, or by using legal mechanisms that allowed temporary seizure or pledging of castles for money. Castles could be pawned to nobles as security for debts, while retaining the right to redeem them later. Another recurring challenge came from jointly held castles, where groups of knightly co-owners could act independently and disrupt regional order. Princes often coordinated efforts to force these communities into dependence. Rivalries with neighbouring powers explain much of Mainz's scattered sphere of control. Competition with the Landgrave of Hesse or the Elector Palatine pulled Mainz into distant strategic positions, while internal schisms could divide castle networks inside the principality itself. At the same time, Mainz showed a consistent effort to densify rule around strong centres, building up areas where administration and authority could be more stable. A key support for Mainz's survival as a secular principality was its ministerial class. Originally unfree servants, who rose into the lower nobility and increasingly filled higher administrative roles. These men formed the managerial backbone that kept Mainz functioning amid competition from stronger neighbours. Under the informal leadership of older high noble families, the archbishopric offered the lower nobility a ladder of advancement. Through military service, financial support, castle holding, office administration, and entry into ecclesiastical institutions. Ambition and institutional survival fed each other. Strengthening one's own family base could align with preserving Mainz's independence as a political actor, because the principality's survival gave the region's lesser nobles a structure within which to thrive. The shifting residence pattern of the archbishops reveals how the city of Mainz lost its earlier place as an uncontested centre. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, the metropolis increasingly slipped from archiepiscopal control as an urban commune formed and grew confident. For a time, city-based ministerials played leading roles in this movement as well, but the city's push for autonomy proved resilient even after violent crises. The murder of an archbishop and the harsh punishment that followed did not end the trend. Later, agreements expanded the city's liberties dramatically, recognised its council, reduced obligations to provide military service, and treated city and archbishop almost like negotiating partners, rather than lord and subject. The archbishop still retained formal claims, but the political reality kept shifting. Rebellions, alliances with discontented groups in surrounding districts, and even the burning of the archbishop's residence signalled how fragile the old model had become. The destroyed residence was never rebuilt, an architectural marker of a political break. As a result, other locations gained importance. A safe base across the Rhine offered a refuge near the rebellious metropolis, while still remaining close to the Principalities' oldest heartland. Another city, long significant, rose higher still. Aschaffenburg, under Mainz's lordship since early medieval times, became the leading secondary residence and then, in practice, a main residence. Its appeal was straightforward: a strong church community, a favourable travel position, and economic capacity to supply a court and host assemblies. A new castle built closer to the town strengthened this role, and the location became a stable anchor in a principality whose main city was no longer reliable. Taken together, the history sketched here produces an apparent contradiction. In power politics, the Archbishopric of Mainz often appears fragile, an elective principality without dynastic continuity, territorially scattered, exposed to neighbours, periodically weakened by schism and challenged by an increasingly autonomous metropolis. Yet structurally, it proved remarkably durable. Since early medieval times, the archbishops had been embedded in the empire's constitutional life as ecclesiastical leaders and as electors. The cathedral chapter and regional nobility, while not always aligned with archiepiscopal aims, were deeply invested in the principality's survival because it preserved their influence and status.